The lights never go out in a hospital, but shadows still find ways to move. Stay quiet. Lean in close. Because what I'm about to tell you are the nightmares that happen after visiting hours, when the halls are empty and something else begins its rounds. The doors shut with a mechanical groan, and the echo carried too long, bouncing off linoleum floors and tiled ceilings until it sounded less like metal and more like something breathing. I told myself it was only the air pressure shift, only the heavy locks of a psychiatric facility closing for the night. But it still felt like a mouth sealing itself shut behind me. The nurse who signed me in gave me a thin smile and told me shadowing the overnight staff would be quiet work. She said it like a warning, not a promise. The air inside was different, heavy and sour, like mildew and bleach fighting each other. The overhead lights hummed faintly, a sound that sat just behind my ears, no matter where I walked. The staff moved in practiced silence, sliding clipboards along counters, keys jangling against their belts like a steady reminder that they were never unarmed. They led me down a corridor lined with doors painted the same pale blue. Each door had a square of thick glass at eye level, but the windows were so scratched and clouded, they looked fogged with breath. Some of them were. I tried not to stare inside the rooms as we passed, but glimpses caught me anyway. A man pacing in slow circles, whispering something I could not hear. A woman sitting perfectly still on her bed, eyes wide, her lips parted as though she were mid-scream, but no sound escaped. Another door rattled hard as we walked by, as if someone had thrown themselves against it. The staff didn't even flinch. They told me the walls absorbed most things if you learned how to stop listening. At the nurses' station, I was shown a chair and told I could watch how they logged each round. The computer screens glowed an unhealthy green against tired faces, and I noticed how each name on the roster had a color beside it. Red for suicide watch, yellow for violent, gray for silent risk. They explained this in a flat voice, as if reciting a grocery list, and then one of them laughed at my expression. "You'll get used to it," she said, though her eyes didn't agree. I wanted to believe it was just nerves, that all this unease was the fault of the locks, the smell, the quiet too thick to be natural. But the feeling in my stomach wasn't nerves. It was recognition. The kind of instinct that presses cold fingers up your spine and whispers that you've walked into something alive. When the intercom crackled above us, I jumped. The nurse only sighed, as though she'd been expecting it. "Someone's already out of bed," she said, reaching for her keys. But when she turned the corner, the cameras showed no one standing in the halls, only the long stretch of shadow broken by a single door creaking open on its own. That was the moment I realized this place didn't sleep, and maybe it never had. The first hour passed in a haze of routine. Charts, rounds, the clink of keys. I stayed close to the nurse, trying to mirror her steady calm, but my eyes kept drifting toward the doors. Behind each small window, shapes shifted, restless even in silence. I told myself I would not stare, but it was impossible not to. That was when I noticed their lips moving. Not all at once, not in chorus, but one here, another there, whispering. At first, I thought it was a trick of the glass. Reflections making mouths seemed to form words. But as I slowed my steps, I caught fragments slipping through. Not them, not staff. Do not look. Each voice fragile, like paper tearing in the dark, but urgent enough to make my chest tighten. I leaned closer to one door where a man crouched in the corner. His eyes darted past me, down the hall, then back again, as if to warn me without being seen. He mouthed a single word: "Walks." The nurse tugged my arm sharply and hissed that we do not engage. But when her back turned, I heard it again. A woman's voice, low and cracked, whispering through the crack beneath her door. He's here when the lights flicker. He waits. My legs felt weak, though I forced myself to keep moving, pretending I had not heard, pretending none of them were watching me, as if I had already been marked. At the nurse's station, the others brushed it off when I asked, telling me patients loved their ghost stories, feeding on each other's madness. But their tight jaws and averted eyes betrayed them. One of the orderlies scribbled something on a chart, his pen trembling just enough to betray the act. They wanted me to believe it was nonsense, but they believed it too. The intercom cracked again, and the lights overhead dipped for the briefest moment. Only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Every door in that hall rattled at once, fists pounding, voices shrieking, not in panic, but in warning. He's walking. He's walking. Do not follow. And then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The nurse told me to sit back down, her voice sharper now. But I could not shake the image of their faces, pale and desperate, pressed to the glass. They were not begging for release. They were begging for me to leave, before the halls filled with someone who did not wear keys at their belt. Someone who was not supposed to be here at all. That night, I began to understand the difference between patients and prisoners. Prisoners knew who their jailers were. Here, no one seemed sure. The night stretched long, hours sliding past in the drone of buzzing lights and the shuffle of rounds. I sat at the nurse's station, half distracted by the dull hum of the monitors, when one of the orderlies leaned in closer to the screen. His face stiffened, and he motioned for me to look. The hallway camera showed nothing but pale tiles, glossy with reflected light. Still, something stirred there. A shadow too thin, too quick, crossing the edge of the frame before dissolving back into emptiness. The nurse dismissed it with a wave, saying the old wiring glitched whenever the power dipped. But the orderly didn't believe her. I could see it in the way his jaw worked tight, the way his eyes flicked to the far end of the hall as though expecting the shadow to finish what it had started. Minutes later, it happened again. This time clearer. A flicker, like a body jerking forward. Shoulders hunched, wrists bound tight in restraints that glinted under the fluorescent light. I leaned closer, expecting to see leather cuffs, the thick straps they used when patients became violent. But the screen showed nothing. The figure twitched against invisible ties, head snapping side to side, straining to break free of bonds that weren't there. The camera buzzed, and the image skipped. For a heartbeat, the figure looked straight into the lens. His eyes were wide, his mouth stretched as if mid-scream, though the monitors carried no sound. Then the feed cleared, and the hallway was empty again. I asked who it was. The nurse didn't answer. She only typed harder into her chart, as though the clatter of keys could drown me out. The orderly finally muttered under his breath, almost too low to catch. He died in that hallway, years ago, choked on his own gag strap. I stared at the screen, at the motionless corridor now lit sterile and clean. No trace of what I'd just seen. No proof except the residue of dread crawling across my skin. And then, flicker. The same shape lurching closer, dragging unseen restraints, shadows of cuffs biting into wrists that should not exist anymore. The camera shuddered and cut to static, but not before showing the figure almost at the nurse's station door. The orderly cursed, reaching for his keys as though locks could hold something that no longer lived. The nurse finally met my eyes. "Do not acknowledge him," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "That is how he gets in. rounds took me deeper than before, down a wing where the walls narrowed and the lights buzzed weaker. The nurse sent me with an orderly to observe, though it felt more like being led into a place no one wanted to go alone. The patients here were silent, most locked in observation rooms with the blinds drawn. Even the air felt different, colder, weighted as though the building itself was holding its breath. Halfway down the corridor, the orderly's radio crackled, then died with a squeal. He muttered about interference and stepped back toward the nurse's station to fix it, leaving me standing under the last humming light. That was when the first door slammed shut behind me. The echo rolled like thunder, loud enough to rattle the glass. I spun, but no one stood there. Another door slammed, then another. The corridor erupted in a violent chorus as steel banged against steel, one after another, until the sound became unbearable. Patients screamed inside their rooms, fists hammering windows, but their faces weren't looking out. They were looking past me, toward the end of the hallway where the light had just gone out. I shouted for the orderly. No answer. The alarms shrieked then, sudden, piercing wails that rattled my chest. Red strobes painted the corridor in harsh flashes, and for a second, I thought the chaos would summon help. But just as quickly as they started, the alarms cut off. The lights died too. I was left in a darkness so complete I could not see my own hands. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, broken only by the faint scrape of something dragging across tile. A chain maybe, or a hand sliding along the wall. Each step brought it closer, deliberate and slow, savoring my panic. I pressed my back to the nearest door, but the patient inside beat against it, screaming for me to move away. Others joined, voices ragged, begging me not to stay in the hall. Their terror was not for themselves, it was for me. The scraping stopped just ahead. I felt it then, the cold pressure of someone standing too close, unseen in the dark. My breath caught. The patients fell silent all at once, every voice cut off mid-cry, as if a hand had closed over their mouths. The quiet was worse than the alarms, worse than the slamming doors. Because in that silence, I knew I was no longer standing in the hall alone. The dark pressed against me like a second skin, swallowing every shape and sound until even my heartbeat seemed borrowed. I tried to step backward, but the door at my back rattled as the patient inside struck it again, screaming not at me, but at whatever stood in front of me. His fists hammered so hard I could feel the vibration against my spine. Still, I saw nothing, only the air shifting, heavier, as if it carried weight and intent. Then came the breath, hot and damp, brushing against my ear. I froze, every muscle turning to stone. A voice, low and ruined, spilled into the silence. It spoke my name, perfectly, slowly, with a cruel intimacy that made my blood feel colder than the walls around me. I had never said my name aloud here. I had not introduced myself to the patients. Yet somehow, it knew. The whisper stretched, repeating, savoring each syllable until my knees trembled. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat, caught beneath the weight of its presence. The patients in the ward shrieked in answer, their voices a broken chorus rising in terror. They were not warning me anymore. They were pleading. I stumbled forward, blindly reaching for the wall, for anything solid to guide me. The lights above flickered once, enough to paint a glimpse in red. The figure was inches from my face, bound in restraints that no longer existed, wrists bleeding where invisible straps cut deep. Its eyes were black voids that reflected nothing. Yet they held me still, as if I had been strapped down too. The darkness swallowed again, and I ran. My Footsteps slammed against the tile, each one chased by that ragged breathing, always just behind me. The corridor twisted, doors slamming as I passed, until I was trapped again at a dead end I did not remember existing. The voice came once more, right against my ear. Softer this time, almost tender. "You should not be here," it whispered. And then the air shifted, not away, but into me, filling my chest, pressing against my heart. My scream tore free at last, echoing down the empty hall, but no one answered. The alarm stayed silent. The lights stayed dead. And in that suffocating dark, I realized the worst truth of all. The figure had not followed me. It was inside me now, waiting for the next night the doors locked and the ward forgot the difference between the living and the dead. The elevator should have taken me to the second floor, where night rounds meant nothing more than checking vitals and restocking supply carts. But the numbers flickered as if confused, skipping, then stalling on a floor I didn't recognize. The doors slid open with a sigh, releasing a draft of air so stale it seemed to have been trapped for decades. What lay beyond was not a hospital floor I had ever seen. The hallway stretched in both directions, cloaked in shadow. Paint peeled from the walls in curling strips, sagging like tired skin. Beds sat abandoned in the open, wheels rusted, mattresses split open to spill yellow stuffing like exposed organs. Dust coated everything, a thick gray film that muffled sound and clung to my shoes as I stepped forward without meaning to. The fluorescent lights overhead were dead, but the glow from the elevator spilled just far enough to show shapes that should not have been there. I could swear one of the bed frames had been dragged recently, the grooves cutting fresh through the dust. My throat tightened. There was no reason for this floor to exist. I knew the hospital well, every corridor, every wing. Yet here it was, an entire level concealed beneath silence and neglect. I reached back for the elevator button, but the doors had already slid shut. The panel on the wall blinked dimly, each number unresponsive under my finger. A pulse of dread crawled over me as I realized I had not just stumbled onto an abandoned wing. I had been brought here. Somewhere deeper in the hall, something rattled. A bed frame, a wheel turning. The sound was faint, but too deliberate to be the building settling. I told myself I should go back, pound the call button until it answered. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me forward, crunching over shattered glass that glimmered faintly in the dark. Every breath smelled of mildew and ash, and as I passed doorways with broken windows, I felt eyes on me. Not alive, not human, but still watching. My heart pounded in my ears. I pressed my hand against one door, its paint flaking under my palm, and it opened an inch with a long sigh. Inside, I saw the outline of a wheelchair, turned toward me as though waiting. That was when the overhead intercom crackled to life, though there should have been no power here. A voice bled through, hollow, soaked in static. It spoke one word: my name. The silence thickened after the intercom went dead, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I forced myself backward toward the elevator, praying the panel would light up again, when a sound stopped me cold. It was faint at first, almost too soft to notice, a rhythmic pulse, steady and mechanical. Beep, beep, beep. I froze, straining to listen. It was unmistakable, the hollow echo of a heart monitor, but there was no power here. The lights overhead were lifeless, the outlets along the walls broken and blackened with age. Still, the sound grew louder, steady as a pulse, dragging me down the corridor toward its source. I told myself I would not go further, that I would wait by the elevator until someone called it back. But curiosity sank its claws in, sharper than fear. Each beep seemed closer to my own heartbeat, syncing with it, pulling me forward step by step. The first room I passed was gutted, its bed frame collapsed, ceiling tiles fallen across the floor. Yet even here, the sound echoed, clear, insistent, as though hidden just out of sight. I pressed on. The dust stirred faintly with my movements, though the air felt stale, untouched for years. Still, in that stillness, I swore I saw the corner of a curtain sway, as if brushed by someone passing unseen. When I reached the next doorway, the beeping stopped. The sudden absence of sound was worse than its presence, like the moment a heart flatlines and leaves nothing but empty silence behind. I stepped into the room, expecting it to be empty like the rest. Instead, in the far corner, stood a heart monitor. Its screen glowed weakly green in the dark, lines jagged across it as though tracking a life still beating. The cords dangled loose, the electrodes swinging, not attached to anything living. Yet the machine continued, beeping, drawing invisible breath from nothing. I moved closer, every instinct screaming to turn back, but I had to see. The screen flickered, the heartbeat slowing, faltering, then spiking hard. I leaned in, and the beeping shifted, no longer steady. It tapped out something unnatural, spelling, forming rhythm into words. The monitor spelled my name. The green line pulsed with every letter, dragging it across the screen again and again. Behind me, something scraped the tile, heavy and deliberate. I turned, but the doorway was empty. Only dust, only silence. Then the monitor flatlined, and from down the corridor, another machine began to beep. The monitor's flatline still rang in my ears as I backed into the hallway. The dust hung thicker now, stirred into the air by movements I could not see. My throat burned as I breathed it in, dry and acrid, like the residue of something burned long ago. I wanted to believe it was my own footsteps that disturbed it. But the streaks on the floor told another story. Long, deliberate lines dragged through the dust, crisscrossing the corridor in patterns too heavy to be made by anything small. I followed one with my eyes, my pulse thudding in my temples. It ended at a wheelchair parked against the wall. Its metal frame rusted, its seat torn open and spilling yellow foam. For a long moment it stayed still. Then, without a sound, the wheels twitched. They rolled once, twice, then pushed forward, gliding across the hall. The rubber tracks cut fresh scars into the dust, proof that this was no trick of my eyes. I stumbled back, breath catching, as the chair pivoted sharply as though someone had yanked it around. It faced me now. The handles pointed toward the dark, the seat open and waiting. My hands shook as I told myself to move away, but before I could take a step, another chair joined it, then another. Doors stood half open all along the corridor, and from the shadows, more wheelchairs rolled out, scraping softly, their wheels groaning against decades of grime. The sound was unbearable. A chorus of turning wheels, metals squealing like voices dragging nails across glass. One chair clattered as its wheel snagged against broken tile, but even that seemed purposeful, like frustration rather than malfunction. I turned to run back to the elevator, but the corridor was already blocked. Half a dozen chairs stood in a crooked line, their wheels still spinning as if they had just arrived. Behind me, the others drew closer, boxing me in. My shoes scraped as I tried to step around them, but each attempt was mirrored, chairs sliding to cut me off, streaking fresh tracks in the dust. It felt like being herded, forced into place, every exit sealed by something unseen but determined. The air grew heavy with the smell of rust and old cloth. I could almost hear the faint creak of unseen weight pressing down into those seats. Then, from deep in the hall, one chair moved faster than the rest, barreling forward as though shoved with violent intent. Its wheels screamed against the floor as it came straight for me. The chair skidded to a halt inches from my legs, the impact rattling through the frame as if an invisible rider had pulled the brakes at the last possible second. My heart pounded so hard I swore it would echo down the hall. The others stood motionless now, aligned in a jagged circle around me, as though waiting for something. The silence was suffocating until a new sound slipped through, the faint crackle of fire. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness. No flames flickered, yet the air carried the unmistakable sting of smoke, acrid and thick. The smell clung to the walls, soaked into the floor, seeping from the very paint. My chest tightened with each breath. Images pressed into my mind without permission. Bodies pressed against locked doors, lungs filling with black smoke, screams swallowed by rising heat. The elevator's control panel had been tagged with stickers I had barely noticed before. Now, in the glow of my trembling flashlight, the residue of charred tape framed the edges. This was not just an abandoned floor. This was the wing, the one they whispered about in staff rooms, always cutting themselves off when I entered. The fire from decades ago. They said it had spread fast, smoke pumping through vents before alarms could be raised. The patients were trapped, many restrained, unable to move as flames crawled along the halls. The hospital rebuilt, whitewashed, erased. But not everything had stayed buried. The wheelchairs scraped again, slow and deliberate, their movements syncing with the phantom crackle of fire growing louder in my ears. I saw black streaks staining the tiles, rising up the walls where smoke had once curled. My light shook as I followed the line of destruction, and for a split second, I swore the walls still burned. Shadows licked up the paint, embers sparking before vanishing in the next blink. The air grew hotter, too hot to be imagination. Sweat stung my eyes, yet my breath came cold, each exhale clouding in front of me like I stood outside in winter. The contradictions tangled together. Heat, cold, smoke, silence. And still the beeping of phantom heart monitors pulsed faintly in the background, steady as a metronome of suffering. My knees buckled as the truth sank in. I was standing in the grave of hundreds, their last moments replaying endlessly. And worse, they knew I was here now. From the corner of the hall, a voice rose, thin and ruined, not screaming, calling. My name, stretched long, like it had burned in the throat that spoke it. I ran. My shoes slipped in the dust, sending clouds spiraling behind me, but I didn't care. The wheelchairs groaned as they shifted aside, opening the path like gates yielding only so they could close again. The air grew thicker, choked with phantom smoke that burned my throat, my lungs clawing for breath that never felt full enough. I pressed forward, desperate for the elevator, for light, for anything that wasn't this cursed wing. As I passed the doors, the glass panes shuddered. At first, I thought it was the pressure of my movement, vibrations rattling the old frames. Then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, pressed against the glass from the other side. Skin bubbled and cracked, eyes burned white, mouths pulled open in eternal screams. They weren't silent, though. Not anymore. The glass trembled under the weight of their voices, 1,000 overlapping pleas spilling out in muffled agony. Do not leave us. Do not let us burn again. Stay. Their words seeped through cracks that should not have carried sound, each one clawing deeper into me. I staggered backward, covering my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't outside anymore. They were inside, speaking directly into the hollow of my skull. One face slammed the glass so hard it spiderwebbed. Another followed, then another. The hallway erupted in pounding, fists and skulls hammering against their prison windows. Each face turned toward me, and in their ruined features, I saw recognition. They knew me. They had always known me. The elevator was just ahead, doors gleaming faintly in the dark. My fingers shook as I stabbed at the button. The panel flickered once, and the doors creaked open with painful slowness. Behind me, the chorus grew louder, their palms slapping the glass in unison, voices chanting, begging, accusing. I stumbled inside the car, but the doors hesitated, stuck halfway as if resisting the command to shut. Through the narrowing gap, I saw them one last time. Row after row of scorched faces, pressed so close their melted skin smeared against the glass. Eyes blistered yet sharp, mouths forming the same desperate plea. Do not abandon us. Then the lights in the hall cut out completely, plunging them into darkness. But I could still hear them, even as the elevator shuddered and carried me away. Their voices followed, burned into me, whispering with every breath. I knew then escape was a lie. The abandoned wing had not let me leave. It had only chosen to send me ahead, carrying their fire with me until it found another place to spread. The morgue was buried deep in the hospital's belly, far below the buzz of fluorescent lights and the chatter of nurses on rounds. Down here, everything was quiet, sealed in tile and steel, the air heavy with disinfectant that never masked the colder smell beneath it. They gave me the night shift because no one else wanted it, just paperwork, they said. Logging in the bodies as they arrived, tagging them, making sure the drawers matched the charts. Easy money, they told me. But easy never felt this heavy. The first night, the orderlies wheeled in 2 covered gurneys. They spoke in clipped tones, voices low, like men whispering in church. I signed their forms with a shaking hand, nodding as if I'd done this before. When they left, the silence rushed back in. It pressed against me, reminding me that I was now the only living person among the dead. I tried to focus on the process. Check the tag, note the time, slide the body into the drawer. Metal scraped against metal as the tray rolled in, the sound too loud in the stillness. I told myself it was just steel, just hinges, but each drawer closing sounded final, like a lock turning on a door. The chills seeped through my gloves. My breath fogged in the fluorescent light, drifting over pale faces that never blinked. Still, I felt watched. My skin prickled with that undeniable sense of eyes tracing me. Each time I glanced back, the room was still. Just the drawers, just the silence. By 3 a.m, my logbook was half filled with neat handwriting, but my hands cramped from gripping the pen too tightly. I set it down, flexing my fingers, and that was when I heard it. A faint shift, almost nothing, like fabric moving against skin. I froze. The sound came again, soft but deliberate. The sheet on the nearest gurney quivered, a tiny flutter as though something beneath had drawn in a breath. My throat tightened, the air suddenly too thin to swallow. I waited, staring, willing myself not to move. The sheet went still. Silence returned. I laughed nervously to myself, too loud in the empty room, and turned back to the logbook. My pen rolled off the counter, clattering onto the tile. I bent to grab it, and in that brief dip of my head, I caught it, the unmistakable rise and fall beneath the white sheet. A chest lifting, a body breathing, and I was alone. I told myself it was the air, a draft maybe, the ancient vents sighing through the ceiling. But no vent could move fabric like that. The sheet rose slow, deliberate, as though lungs beneath it pulled at the stale morgue air. My stomach turned to stone. I stepped closer. Foolish curiosity stronger than sense, and froze again as the fabric stilled instantly, lying flat as though nothing had stirred at all. I backed away, my shoes squeaking faintly against the tile. And that was when the second gurney shifted. Not just a breath, more violent. The sheet buckling, collapsing, then rising again in jerks, like a body trapped in the dream of drowning. My hand went to the nearest drawer handle, clutching cold steel, as though a line of metal doors could shield me. The silence in the room grew unbearable, every second drawn out, until the sound of fabric rasping filled it once more. It was not one gurney anymore. It was all of them. Every sheet lined neat and pale in rows, beginning to stir. Some rose gently, barely perceptible. Others shook hard enough to rattle the frames. I wanted to run, but my legs rooted themselves in place. My breath hitched, each exhale too loud, too alive. I whispered out loud, though, to who I don't know. Maybe myself, maybe them. "You're not supposed to move." My voice cracked, sounding absurd in the heavy stillness. The sheet nearest me shifted again. This time the corner peeled back, just slightly. Enough for a sliver of skin to show, pale, waxen. Lips parted in stillness. But the moment the sheet slipped, the mouth opened wider, like it had been waiting for air. A sound rasped out, dry and hollow. Not speech, not quite a groan, just the unmistakable scrape of breath from a throat that should have been sealed forever. The others answered. One by one, muffled gasps and sighs seeped from beneath white coverings. It was not frantic. It was rhythmic. A chorus of breathing, ragged but synchronized, filling the morgue with something worse than screams. The dead did not cry out. They inhaled. They exhaled. They waited. My back pressed against the cold wall, logbook abandoned, pen still on the floor. The overhead light flickered once, and I thought, in that stutter of shadow, I saw hands pressing upward beneath the fabric. Not one, not two, all of them, straining. And then the room fell quiet. The sheets lay still again. But I knew if I stepped closer, I would see chests still rising, still falling, breathing steady as mine. The silence after their breathing stopped was worse than the sound itself. It stretched on and on until I began to believe I had imagined everything. My chest burned with the need to run, but my legs would not obey. Instead, I stood there, waiting, listening, every nerve strung tight as wire. That was when the air shifted. The morgue was already cold, but this was different. It was sharp, biting, the kind of chill that slides beneath skin and grips bone. I drew in a breath and saw it puff white before me, fogging in the dim fluorescent light. My stomach dropped. The vents above me rattled once, though no air pushed through them. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, like wind seeping through cracks, a hiss, a sigh. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Words, whispers winding down through the ducts, curling into the corners of the room like smoke. I couldn't catch all of them, not clearly, but phrases drifted close enough to sting. Still here. Stay. Come closer. My heart pounded so loud, I almost drowned them out. Yet the whispers swelled, overlapping, countless voices weaving together into something that felt less like speech and more like intent. I backed toward the door, but the cold intensified with every step, seeping up from the tile beneath me. My teeth chattered, even as sweat clung to my palms. The drawers began to groan, not all at once, but slowly, methodically. A rattle here, a metallic scrape there until the sound spread across the rows like a ripple. The whispers inside the vents grew excited, urgent, tumbling over one another as if beckoning. My name threaded through them now, unmistakable, stretched thin and ruined, but mine all the same. I pressed my back to the door, fingers fumbling for the handle, but it would not turn. My breath fogged heavier, vision blurring, while the vents above seemed to breathe with me. Each exhale of mine answered by their inhale, pulling at me, promising I would not leave alone. Then, from the far end of the room, one drawer slid open with a metallic shriek, the sound echoing like a scream. The sheet inside rose with it, not fluttering, not slipping, but lifting, as though pulled by the figure beneath it. The whispers fell silent all at once, leaving only the hiss of cold air and the slow, deliberate sound of someone drawing breath in the dark. The open drawer gaped like a wound, the sheet inside trembling as though it were breathing faster now. I wanted to shut my eyes, to convince myself it was only the cold, only the drafts through broken vents. But I couldn't look away. The fabric pulled tight against a face beneath, the hollow shape of a nose, the ridge of a brow, the slight part of lips. My stomach nodded, and still I watched as the sheet slipped lower, exposing skin that looked waxy and gray. Then the corpse moved. The body sat up in one sharp motion, joints cracking in the silence. Its head snapped forward, eyes closed, mouth stretching wider and wider until its jaw seemed ready to unhinge. I stumbled back, spine slamming against the wall, but the sound I expected never came. No guttural cry, no wail from the dead. Instead, the scream tore from my own throat, ripped out as though the corpse had stolen my voice before I could even fight it. The sound echoed back at me, too raw, too loud. My own voice ricocheted around the cold chamber until it felt like I was listening to someone else unravel. The corpse's mouth worked wider, lips cracking, throat quivering. But it was my lungs convulsing, my breath shattering, my voice bleeding into the morgue. I clutched my throat, desperate to stop. But the scream poured on without my consent, ragged and endless. The drawers rattled violently now, as if answering the cry, sheets bulging as more shapes stirred within. My eyes blurred, tears hot against frozen skin, while the whispers returned, weaving through my scream like a twisted harmony. They repeated one phrase over and over, rising above the noise. "Give it back, give it back." The corpse leaned closer, its mouth still open, its expression one of hunger more than agony. My scream grew weaker, my throat raw, but it did not stop. It was draining me, bleeding my sound into its hollow chest. The corpse's skin flushed faintly, as if warming with each note stolen, while I sagged lower, knees buckling, strength fleeing with every breath. The lights flickered hard, and for a single flash I saw every corpse in the room upright, mouths open wide, feeding on the echo of my own voice. And I knew if I didn't break free now, there would be nothing left of me but silence filling their lungs. I staggered through the rows, throat burning raw, every scream dragged from me until it felt like I was hollow. The corpses leaned from their drawers, sheets sliding down their shoulders, mouths still gaping, waiting for more. My voice faltered to a rasp, but they would not release me. They did not need to, because the morgue itself had learned how to feed. I lurched toward the door, fumbling with the handle. It rattled beneath my hand, locked tight, the steel cold enough to burn my skin. Behind me, a drawer shrieked open fully, metal scraping like nails across glass. Before I could turn, hands shot out. Gray, stiff fingers clutching my arms, dragging me backward with impossible strength. I thrashed, heels kicking against the tile, but more hands joined, pale and relentless. They pulled me into the open cavity, my back slamming against the cold tray. Sheets tangled around me, wet with something I did not want to name. I gasped, choking, as the lid above began to slide shut. The world narrowed to a rectangle of fading light. I screamed one last time, my voice cracking into nothing, but the corpses around me echoed it back, their mouths shaping my sound until I could not tell if it was mine anymore. Then the drawer slammed closed with finality, sealing me inside a coffin of steel. Darkness swallowed everything. My breath fogged in the suffocating chill, and I clawed at the sides, nails screeching against metal. No one would hear me. No one ever did. And yet, beneath the din of my panic, I caught it. The steady rhythm of the others breathing. Not corpses, not dead, alive, trapped, endlessly waiting. The whispers seeped through the vents even here, curling close, coiling into my skull. "Now you know," they hissed. "Now you belong." It hit me then. The truth I had ignored since the first sheet shifted. This was never about the dead breaking free. It was about the living being pulled in. The morgue wasn't their prison. It was mine. As the air thinned and my vision blurred, I realized there was no difference between us anymore. My body heaved for breath, but the drawers answered, breathing with me, keeping rhythm. And when the silence finally came, it would not be mine alone. It would be theirs, waiting for the next to join. The flyer promised easy money, a clinical trial at the university hospital, just a few nights in their research ward, some monitoring, a handful of blood tests. The pay was more than I had made in months. I told myself it was safe, controlled, run by men in white coats with clipboards and sterile gloves. But the moment I signed my name, a cold ripple of regret crept into me, as though the ink itself had bound me tighter than I realized. The ward was buried in a quiet corner of the hospital, far from the busy wings where nurses hurried and pagers screamed. This place was hushed, sealed, walls painted a pale that felt less like comfort and more like silence. There were 6 of us in total, strangers lined up like volunteers at confession. They fitted us with wristbands and electrodes, their wires snaking into machines that hummed faintly, green lights blinking in steady rhythm. The doctor spoke in rehearsed tones, explaining nothing beyond what we already knew. They were testing something new, something that required extended observation. They assured us there would be food, rest, privacy. Their smiles were precise, their eyes sharp, watching us not as people but as numbers waiting to be tallied. That first night, I lay on the narrow bed beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, staring at the blank ceiling. Sleep would not come. The sheets were too stiff, the air too cold, and beneath it all I could feel the gaze of cameras watching from the corners. Every breath, every twitch of my fingers, every whispered thought felt captured, logged, measured against some invisible standard. From the bed across the room, a girl whispered to me, her voice carrying in the sterile hush. "Do not close your eyes too long," she said. I asked her why, but she only turned her face to the wall, the wires trailing from her skin, quivering, as if they pulsed with a life of their own. I rolled onto my side, clutching the blanket, and told myself I would only rest a little, just enough to get through the long night. My eyelids dragged heavy, and just as I sank toward sleep, I felt it, a prickling sting in my arm, sharp and sudden. I opened my eyes, but no one stood there. Only the faint gleam of a needle already embedded in my vein, though I had never given them permission to place it. The machine beside me purred, drawing blood into a vial marked not with my name, but with a number. The second night was worse. Sleep tugged at me in heavy waves, but each time I drifted close, a sound snapped me awake. At first, it was faint, no more than the rustle of sheets. But then it grew sharper, frantic, the scrape of restraints against metal, the violent thrum of bodies fighting to be free. I sat up, heart pounding, staring across the dimly lit ward. The girl in the next bed convulsed against her straps, her back arching, wrists jerking so violently I swore the leather would snap. I opened my mouth to call for help, but the word died in my throat. Her face tilted toward me in the half-dark, and I saw her mouth. The lips were sealed shut with black thread, crude and uneven, piercing her skin in harsh knots. Her muffled cries leaked out anyway, broken by stitches that tore as she strained against them. I scrambled backward against the wall, my breath ragged. And then I realized she was not alone. One by one, shapes writhed in their beds. The man across from me kicked so hard his cot screeched across the tile, but his mouth too was sewn tight, jaw working against the thread until blood stained his chin. The air filled with the sickening sound of muffled wails, wet and desperate. A chorus of voices smothered beneath black stitching. I shouted for the doctors, for anyone, but no one came. The hall outside remained still. The cameras above blinked green, recording, indifferent. My voice felt swallowed in that room, as if the walls themselves absorbed any cry for help. The machines beside each bed hummed steadily, drawing blood, recording vitals, while their subjects fought like animals trapped in their own skin. The girl turned again, her eyes wide and wild, begging me to do something. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My body locked in place as if waiting for someone to tell me I was not seeing what I saw. And then, as suddenly as it began, the ward fell silent. Every subject slumped against their straps, still breathing, but motionless. The black thread glistened wet in the dim light, their mouths sealed once again. I was alone with the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. And as I lay back down, trembling, I felt something tug against my lips, faint and sharp. My hand brushed my mouth. A single stitch, black thread, tight and new. I woke to the scrape of shoes against tile, soft and measured. The ward was still dark, but shadows moved between the beds, gliding with purpose. My breath caught in my throat as I forced my eyes mostly shut, feigning sleep. Through narrow slits, I saw the nurses, though they were not like the ones from the day. Their uniforms hung loose and pale, their faces masked, eyes sharp as scalpels. They whispered to each other, voices low, coded, the words stripped of meaning. 6 for compliance, 9 for failure, 4 marked again. The numbers meant nothing to me, but their rhythm felt rehearsed, as though part of a language never meant for patients to hear. One of them leaned over the girl in the next bed, pressing her head still with gloved fingers. From her pocket, she drew a marker, black and thick, and scrawled something across the girl's forehead. A number. It shone faintly in the half-light, stark against her pale skin. The girl didn't stir, though her chest rose and fell in restless rhythm, as if some drug had locked her in half-consciousness. I lay still, pulse racing, as they moved to the next subject, repeating the ritual. 7 for resistance, 2 for observation. Their hands worked quick and practiced, marking foreheads, logging the numbers on clipboards. When one nurse passed near me, I forced my body into stillness, every muscle aching from the strain. I felt the cool press of her glove against my temple, the faint scent of antiseptic sharp in my nose. The marker squealed softly as she drew across my skin, leaving behind ink I could not see but could feel, heavy and wrong, like a brand searing into me. They moved on without pause, their coded whispers overlapping. 3 unstable, 11 compromised. The language wove like a chant, a lullaby stripped of comfort. I waited until their shapes faded back into the hall, the door clicking shut behind them. The ward was silent again, but I could not rest. My fingers trembled as I touched my forehead, tracing the ridge of dried ink there. A number, my number. Across the beds, faint glimmers of black shone where others had been marked. We had become tallies, experiments logged in a ledger written in skin. And then, from the corner where the cameras blinked, I swore I heard a new whisper. Not theirs. A voice dry and thin, threading straight into my ear. It spoke my number, over and over, like it had always belonged to me. The next night, the ward did not bother pretending to be quiet. I woke to the sound of straps thrashing against metal frames, patients convulsing in their beds, muffled cries rising beneath stitched lips. The machines hummed steady, indifferent, recording numbers and heartbeats while the room turned into a cage. I sat up, heart pounding, and that was when I saw them. 2 figures in white coats stood at the far end of the room, their faces hidden behind masks that gleamed under the weak lights. They moved without urgency, as though the chaos around them meant nothing. One by one, they studied the numbers on our foreheads, jotting notes, muttering coded phrases I could not decipher. When they reached the man across from me, they stopped. Their hands hovered above him for a moment, before the taller one nodded. Without a word, they released his restraints. He bolted upright, eyes wild. But before he could stumble away, they seized him by the arms. His muffled scream bled into the air, raw and frantic. He kicked against the floor, heels squealing against tile. But they dragged him with practiced ease. His head snapped toward me as they hauled him past, his stitched mouth tearing wider, leaking blood down his chin. His eyes begged for help I could not give. As they pulled him through the doorway, his hands flailed desperately. Fingers clawed across the tiles, leaving streaks of red that smeared into grotesque trails. He tried to catch the doorframe, nails breaking against the steel, blood spattering in arcs. But they dragged him through anyway. The door slammed behind them with a metallic shudder. The ward fell silent. Every patient froze, as though the absence of his struggle had stolen the fight from their bodies. The machines beeped steadily, mocking the sudden stillness. I sat rigid, staring at the crimson streaks across the floor. The handprints looked too fresh, too alive, as though they might keep crawling even without him. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track. But I knew he wasn't coming back. Not him. Not anyone they took. The lights overhead flickered once, shadows bending across the walls. The stains seemed darker now, spreading, seeping as if the blood itself wanted to crawl closer. And beneath the hum of the machines, I swore I heard it, dragging footsteps returning down the hall. Only this time, there were more of them. I must have drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, because when I opened my eyes, the ward was no longer the same. The overhead lights burned white, too bright, washing every surface in a sterile glow that hurt to look at. My arms and legs wouldn't move. Straps cut into my wrists, leather biting deep, buckled so tight I could feel the pulse fighting against them. My chest heaved against a band across my ribs, every breath shallow and frantic. Beside me, the machines purred, their monitors glowing with steady green lines. Tubes snaked from my arms, thicker than before. The sting of needles buried so deep, I couldn't tell where the skin ended and the metal began. My blood crawled through the tubes into glass jars arranged neatly on a cart. Each jar filled slow and dark, labeled with precise black lettering. I turned my head, my throat raw, and squinted to read the names. None of them were mine. Every jar bore someone else's name, scrawled in handwriting too sharp, too deliberate. My heart kicked against my ribs when I recognized one of them. The man who had been dragged out the night before, his bloody handprints still staining the tile. Another jar carried the name of the girl with the black thread sealing her lips. And then I saw it. The final label. My replacement. A name I didn't know, yet it had already taken my place. The realization sank into me like ice. I was not being monitored. I was being harvested, drained. Every drop of me destined to serve another who would walk free under my number, my records, my existence. I screamed, but the sound came out strangled, caught beneath the pressure of the straps. The other patients did not move, their eyes open but lifeless, staring blankly at the ceiling as their bloodlines emptied into jars beside mine. One of the masked nurses appeared, her steps silent, her gloved hand brushing the labels as though to admire them. She leaned close, so close I could see my reflection in her blank visor. Her voice was a whisper, precise and cold. "You are done here." The lights flickered once, and in that stuttering second, I saw them all. The drawers filled with jars instead of bodies, each glowing faintly with what they had stolen. The replacements waiting somewhere beyond, alive because we were not. The nurse turned away, wheeling the cart of jars into the dark. My eyes blurred, and the straps dug deeper, holding me still. The machine hummed on, steady, patient, and I understood then the ward's true experiment. It wasn't survival. It was erasure. The clinic was quiet that night. Too quiet for a building with walls so old they should have groaned with every shift of the wind. I sat at the nurse's station, fighting sleep. When the call came through to check the East Wing, no one wanted it. The others exchanged glances, muttered excuses, avoided eye contact. I told myself it was nothing, just a hallway, just part of the building no longer used. So I volunteered, eager to prove I wasn't afraid of shadows and silence. The halls were dim, lit by old fixtures that buzzed like dying insects. My footsteps echoed louder than I liked, bouncing back at me from walls that felt too close. Paint peeled in long strips from the plaster, curling down like brittle paper. The scent of antiseptic lingered faintly, but beneath it, I caught something else. Something damp and sour, like water that had been standing too long. The entrance to the East Wing was marked by a heavy door with a cracked observation window. A sign still hung crooked above it, though the letters had long since faded. My flashlight beam wavered across the glass, revealing only the faint outline of a corridor stretching deep into shadow. I pushed the door open, hinges shrieking in protest, the sound far too loud in the hush of the clinic. The air changed instantly. Cooler, denser. My skin prickled as though I had stepped into a place untouched for years. Dust coated the floor in thick layers, disturbed only by faint streaks I couldn't explain. Wheel tracks, shoe prints. They stretched into the dark and vanished beyond the reach of my light. I told myself to go just far enough to check the locks, to prove I had done my job. But something about the hallway pulled me forward. My flashlight swept across doorways lining the corridor, each door shut, each window blackened from within. The silence deepened, the further I walked, until I could hear only my own breathing, ragged and quick despite my efforts to steady it. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though every step carried me no closer to its end. The shadows shifted at the edge of my vision, retreating when I looked directly, advancing when I looked away. My gut twisted, instincts screaming at me to turn back, but pride pushed me onward. Behind me, the door I had entered creaked. Then it shut with a final, echoing thud, sealing me inside the east wing. The sound reverberated through the long hallway, and in that endless stretch of dark, I realized I wasn't walking alone. The first few steps felt ordinary, my flashlight beam cutting across chipped plaster and rusted door handles. But the farther I went, the stranger it became. The hallway did not end. It stretched on, each door identical to the last, each buzzing light humming just above the edge of hearing. My pulse quickened as I realized I had been walking for minutes without reaching the bend I swore I had seen ahead. The floor beneath me no longer crunched with dust, but glistened faintly, reflecting the pale lights overhead. I knelt and touched it with trembling fingers. Warm. My stomach lurched at the slick texture clinging to my skin. Not water, not spilled cleaning solution. Something thicker. I wiped it quickly against my pants, refusing to let the thought form fully. But the warmth stayed, seeping through the fabric like a stain that would not wash out. The lights flickered. Their buzzing grew louder, then dimmed into silence before surging back with a sickly glow. I turned, desperate to see how far I'd come, but the doorway where I had entered was gone. Behind me, the hallway stretched just as impossibly, swallowing the way back. My throat tightened as if the walls themselves pressed closer, urging me forward. The air reeked now, copper and rot woven together, thick enough to make me gag. My shoes squealed softly against the wet floor with every step, leaving prints that smeared red in the light. I told myself it wasn't blood. It couldn't be. But the lie thinned with each stride. The warmth pulsed underfoot, almost alive, as though I walked on veins instead of tile. One of the overhead lights sputtered and burst, showering sparks into the hallway. For an instant, in the flash of darkness, I swore I saw shapes crouched along the walls. Low, hunched figures, faces pressed against the doors, mouths moving silently. When the light buzzed back on, the hall was empty again, but the floor around me rippled faintly, as if disturbed by their retreat. I pressed onward, breath ragged, but the hall only stretched further, doors endless, buzzing growing unbearable. The warmth beneath my shoes spread wider, rising in waves, and I realized I was leaving more than footprints. Trails of red smeared outward, branching like roots across the tiles. And somewhere up ahead, too far to see but close enough to feel, something was waiting at the end of this impossible hall, drawing me deeper with every step. The buzzing lights faltered again, dimming until only every third fixture sputtered with a sickly glow. The rest of the hallway dissolved into gloom. That was when I heard it. Hinges groaning, metal rubbing against metal. One of the patient doors just ahead creaked open by itself, spilling nothing but darkness inside. My steps faltered. Another door followed, then another. Soon the sound echoed from both sides of the corridor, a staggered chorus of locks giving way, hinges sighing as if the building itself were exhaling. I aimed my flashlight into the nearest room, but the beam seemed to shrink against the black. Shapes writhed inside, moving unnaturally, flowing along the floor and walls as if they weren't bound by bone or flesh. The shadows stretched toward me, curling like fingers before snapping back, whispering in voices too thin to belong to anything living. The whispers overlapped, dry and frantic, weaving my name into their fragments. My throat clenched as the syllables coiled through the hall, each voice echoing from a doorway that now yawned wide. I stepped back, but the slick floor betrayed me, my shoe sliding against the warmth beneath. The shadows surged at the sound, twitching, eager, as though they fed on the smallest sign of weakness. Every door along the corridor was open now. From each one came whispers, murmurs, hisses, words I couldn't understand, stitched together with ones I could. Stay. Belong. Never leave. The shadows pooled across the thresholds, spreading across the tiles like spilled ink, slithering toward my feet. I raised my flashlight higher, hands trembling. For the briefest moment, the beam cut across a figure inside one of the rooms. It wasn't shadow. It wasn't smoke. It was something hunched, faceless, its body twitching in jerks as if it had only just learned how to move. The door slammed behind it, leaving me staring at an empty hall again, my breath ragged. But the whispers did not stop. They grew louder, feeding on my panic, threading into my ears until they drowned out the buzzing lights. The air thickened, vibrating with them, the shadows spreading faster now, crawling toward me in frantic waves. The nearest door shuddered, its frame rattling violently, and from within came a voice clearer than the rest. Hoarse, broken, but unmistakable. It was my own. The whispers swelled until the very walls seemed to vibrate, a suffocating hum that pressed against my skull. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape the tide of shadows slithering across the floor. That was when I heard it, the shrill squeal of rusted wheels grinding against tile. The sound cut through the whispers, sharp and unbearable, coming from somewhere ahead in the dark. My flashlight quivered in my grip as the beam caught the shape rolling slowly into view. A gurney. Its frame shuddered with every turn of the wheels, the old metal screaming like an animal being dragged to slaughter. A sheet covered the figure lying on top, but it was not still. The fabric shifted in uneven bursts, rising and falling with breath that shouldn't exist. I froze, heart thudding so hard it drowned out the whispers. The gurney inched closer, its wheels squealing louder, echoing through the endless corridor. The sheet rippled violently once, as though something beneath had twisted hard. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp, but the thing beneath must have felt it, because the fabric lifted higher, as if straining upward to see me. I took a step back, then another. The floor slicked beneath my shoes, the warmth soaking deeper, and I almost slipped. The gurney rolled faster, the wheels shrieking, the sheet rising and falling with frantic desperation. I knew I should turn and run, but the hall behind me stretched the same as before, endless, offering no escape. The gurney stopped suddenly, slamming against the wall with a crash that rattled through my bones. The sheet ballooned upward, as if the figure beneath had sat up, but it didn't fall back into place. It hovered, held aloft by whatever was inside, the fabric clinging to a shape that writhed against it. Fingers, too many of them, pushed up against the sheet from within, tracing the outline of hands across the surface. The whispers returned, hushed but urgent, threading into my ears. They spoke in rhythm with the rise and fall of the sheet, each breath inside the gurney echoed by words outside it. Closer. Closer. I pressed myself against the wall, fighting to stay upright. But the gurney jerked forward again. The sheet tore at the corner with a faint rip, just enough to reveal the shape of a mouth stretching wide, teeth pressing against the fabric. And then it breathed in, hard and deep, as if it were drawing the air straight out of my lungs. I ran. My shoes slipped against the wet floor, every step a desperate scramble as the gurney's shrieking wheels followed close behind. The whispers lashed at me from every open door, chanting, urging, mocking. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but ahead, At last, I saw it. A glowing red exit sign, hazy through the flickering lights. The sight filled me with a surge of frantic hope. I pushed harder, heart slamming in my chest, convinced that if I reached that door, I would be free. The corridor stretched longer with each step, but finally I touched the handle. My hand slipped, slick with sweat, but the bar gave way, the door groaning open. Bright light spilled through the gap, blinding after so much shadow. I threw myself forward, tumbling into it, my chest heaving with relief. But when my vision cleared, my stomach dropped into a pit of ice. I was still standing in the hallway. The same buzzing lights hummed overhead. The same endless row of doors yawned open, their whispers curling into the air. Behind me, the exit door had vanished. Nothing but more wall and more endless corridors stretching on forever. I staggered, breath shallow, mind scrambling to make sense of it. The gurney stood in front of me now, waiting, its wheels perfectly still. The sheet that had writhed and twisted lay calm at last, smoothed as though someone had carefully tucked it into place. The whispers hushed, fading into a silence more suffocating than sound. I looked down. The warmth underfoot pulsed faintly, spreading outward in crimson stains that branched toward the gurney. My hands trembled as I reached for my chest, and that was when I felt it, the weight of fabric clinging to me. I tore at it, pulling, but my fingers only brushed smooth linen, tucked tight, pinning me flat. The sheet wasn't on the gurney anymore. It was on me. My breath came ragged, muffled beneath the cloth. The lights flickered, and in their stuttering glow, I caught the reflection in a black window along the hall. A figure on the gurney, sheet drawn tight, its chest rising and falling. My chest. The whispers returned, soft and final, as the corridor stretched on without end. Belong. Stay. Forever. And with the last flicker of light, the sheet pulled tighter, sealing me into the endless hallway where no exit ever waited and no one ever left. The hospital seemed like a different world at night. The halls that bustled with chatter and clattering carts during the day now stretched silent, the fluorescent lights humming faintly above the echo of my shoes. I clutched my clipboard tighter than I needed to, my badge swinging nervously against my chest. First night shift. First chance to prove I could handle the long hours, the pressure, the weight of responsibility. I told myself eagerness would outweigh fear, but the unease in my stomach betrayed me. The senior nurse walked me through the basics, her voice calm, efficient, as though nothing about these hours unnerved her. She showed me how to check vitals, where to find supplies, which rooms needed extra monitoring. Her words blurred together under the constant hum of the lights and the muffled beeping of machines. I nodded, smiled when I should, pretended confidence I didn't feel. At 2 a.m, she left me at the nurse's station to log rounds while she checked the West Wing. Alone, the silence felt heavier. The glow of the monitors painted everything in sickly greens and blues. I tried to focus on the paperwork, but every creak of the building pulled my attention to the hallways. A door closing far away. The rattle of a cart no one was pushing. The faint sound of heels clicking against tile. I told myself the sound was her returning, that I would see her any second. But when I glanced up, the hallway was empty. The sound continued anyway. Steady, deliberate, growing louder until it stopped just outside the station. My breath caught, waiting. No one appeared. That was when I saw her. A woman standing at the far end of the corridor, dressed in a nurse's uniform, older than the ones we wore now. Starched white, her cap tilted neatly. She stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of her, face half hidden in the dim light. Relief flooded me. Someone else on shift, someone I hadn't been introduced to yet. I started to lift a hand to wave. She smiled first, slow, too wide, the kind of smile that didn't belong in a place meant for healing. My hand dropped before I could return it, and in the hush of that endless corridor, I felt the truth press into me with a weight colder than any training could prepare me for. She hadn't been introduced because she wasn't supposed to be here at all. She came closer without a sound, her shoes making no echo on the tile. I sat rigid at the nurse's station, every instinct telling me to run. But when she reached me, her presence was strangely calming. She leaned over my shoulder, her voice low and steady, guiding me through the forms scattered across the desk. Her tone was patient, almost maternal, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. I clung to her instructions, grateful for the distraction from my nerves. She corrected my mistakes gently, her gloved finger tapping the right boxes, her handwriting looping neatly when she filled in what I missed. "You'll get used to it," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. Her eyes, pale as smoke, lingered on me a moment longer than felt natural. Still, I let her guide me. The fear I'd felt when I first saw her ebbed away, replaced by the strange comfort of her certainty. We sat together for what felt like hours, moving from form to form, her presence steady at my side. Sometimes she hummed softly, an old tune I didn't recognize, though it tugged at something deep in my memory, like a lullaby half forgotten. Each time I lifted my head, the corridor behind her seemed darker, longer, but I forced myself to focus on the neat strokes of her pen, the careful way she said my name. When the senior nurse finally returned, I straightened quickly, eager to show her the progress we had made. But she frowned at the stack of finished paperwork, her eyes narrowing. "You did all this?" she asked. I nodded, smiling nervously, and gestured toward the older nurse who had been helping me. The words caught in my throat when I realized the chair beside me was empty. The pen lay still on the desk, ink fresh at its tip. The humming had stopped. The air was colder now, heavy with silence. The senior nurse looked at me strangely, but she didn't ask again. She only told me to take a short break, her voice clipped and uneasy. I sat there long after she walked away, staring at the forms filled in a handwriting that wasn't mine. The loops were too neat, too precise, too old-fashioned to belong to anyone alive. And when I traced the letters with my finger, I realized they matched the ones etched faintly on the name tag of the uniformed woman I'd seen in the hallway. The name belonged to a nurse who had died here decades ago. The next evening, I couldn't stop myself from asking about her. I waited until the ward quieted, until the steady beeps of monitors dulled my nerves. And then I mentioned the older nurse who had helped me through paperwork. I expected recognition, maybe a fond smile from someone who remembered her. Instead, the station fell into a silence so heavy, it pressed into my chest. One of the orderlies glanced up, his face pale under the fluorescent glow. "What nurse?" he asked flatly. I described her uniform, the starched white dress, the cap tilted perfectly in place. I mentioned her soft voice, the way she hummed as she worked. The senior nurse shook her head slowly, her lips tightening. "No one dresses like that anymore," she said. "Not here." She exchanged a glance with the orderly that told me I had said something I wasn't supposed to. I pushed harder, insisting I wasn't mistaken, that I knew what I saw. Finally, the orderly leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough that I had to strain to hear. "That sounds like Helen. But Helen's been dead 10 years. My laugh came out brittle. forced. I searched their faces for a hint of a joke, but none came. Their silence was steady, unblinking. They believed it. They wanted me to believe it too. That night, I lingered by the records room, pretending to file charts until I found the courage to search. Old binders lined the shelves, names written in fading ink. My hands shook as I flipped through them until I found it. Her name. The handwriting looped across the pages in the same style that now filled my own forms. My stomach turned cold as I traced the date. She had died on a night shift, alone in the ward, her heart stopping before anyone found her. The room seemed to darken around me, the hum of the overhead lights fading into a low, steady humming I recognized too well. The same tune she had hummed at my side the night before. My throat went dry, my breath shallow. I dropped the binder, its thud echoing too loud, and turned toward the hall. She was there, standing at the far end once more, pale eyes fixed on me, her smile wider than it had been. The humming didn't stop when she opened her mouth. It grew louder, spilling from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't see. And then, impossibly, I heard my name stitched into the melody. I couldn't shake her presence, no matter how much I tried to bury myself in the monotony of rounds and charts. Every corner I turned, I expected to see her waiting, her pale eyes catching mine, her smile stretched too far. The humming followed me through the halls like a second shadow, faint but insistent, threading beneath the beeps and buzz of machines. One night, I slipped into the supply closet, hoping to steady myself away from the eyes of the staff who now avoided my questions. The small room was crowded with carts of gauze, racks of gowns, bins stacked high with linens. I shut the door behind me, pressing my AER forehead to the cool wood, trying to breathe. That was when I noticed it. The smell. Not the sterile sting of disinfectant, but something metallic and heavy. Copper. My stomach twisted as I pushed past a row of folded scrubs, following the stench to the back. There, hanging alone from a rusted hook, was a uniform. It was exactly as I remembered it. Stiff white fabric, the cap pinned neatly on the collar. But the fabric was ruined. The front of the dress was soaked in brown stains, thick and dark, the unmistakable crust of blood that had long since dried. It clung to the fibers like it had seeped straight from a wound too deep to heal. My hand shook as I reached out, fingertips brushing the stiff material. The moment I touched it, the humming swelled in my ears, loud as if she stood just behind me. I spun, flashlight trembling in my grip, but the closet was empty. The shadows in the corners didn't feel still, though. They pressed closer, breathing with me. The uniform swayed lightly on its hook, though no air stirred. For a heartbeat, I swore I saw a shape inside it. Shoulders too broad, a body standing in the fabric, waiting. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, knocking a tray of instruments to the floor. The crash rang out sharp and metallic, and the humming cut off. The silence was worse. It pressed into me, heavy as earth on a grave. I forced the closet door open, stumbling into the hallway, but the image of that blood-soaked uniform stayed burned into my mind. And as I caught my breath, I realized something terrifying. The scent of copper hadn't stayed behind. It clung to me now, woven into my skin. The halls were hushed when I left the closet, but the air felt heavier, as though the hospital itself knew I had touched what should have been left alone. My shoes whispered across the tile, carrying the copper scent that clung to me like a second skin. Every shadow felt watchful. Every flicker of the overhead lights felt deliberate. I tried to tell myself I only needed to finish the shift, survive until dawn. and I could walk out and never come back. But the night was far from done with me. At the end of the corridor, she appeared, the older nurse in her starched white dress, spotless now, as though the blood had never been there. Her cap gleamed under the light, and her eyes were pale and unblinking. She smiled, the same too-wide curve that had haunted me since the first night. Only this time, she wasn't empty-handed. In her grip, glinting under the fluorescence, was a syringe. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, too thick, too dark to be anything clean. She held it with practiced ease, her fingers steady, the way a nurse would carry medicine meant to heal. Her steps echoed, slow and certain, as she began to walk toward me. My back pressed against the wall, every muscle trembling. I wanted to shout, to call for the senior nurse, for anyone, but my voice locked in my throat. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The corridor stretched around her, and with every flicker of the lights, she was closer, her shoes silent now, her smile never fading. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost kind, though the chill in it made my stomach knot. "It's time to join my round." The syringe gleamed as she raised it, the needle catching the light, sharp as hunger. The humming began again, low and steady, vibrating through the walls, threading into my chest until my heartbeat matched its rhythm. I tried to move, to run, but the floor beneath me seemed to hold me fast, sticky and unyielding. Her shadow stretched long across the tiles, curling around my feet like restraints. And as she lifted the syringe higher, her smile widened until it split too far, stretching into something inhuman. The last thing I saw was the needle's tip gleaming inches from my skin, and the pale reflection of my own terrified face in her unblinking eyes. The operating theater looked different at night. The bright lights overhead glared down like interrogators, bleaching the walls into sterile emptiness. The air reeked faintly of bleach and iron, a mix that clung to my throat no matter how often I swallowed. I was only an intern, green and untested, eager to learn. But there was something unnatural about standing in that room after hours, when the rest of the hospital slept. The surgeons worked with mechanical precision, their masks hiding everything but their eyes. I stood at the edge of the table, my gloved hands trembling as I passed instruments, trying to anticipate each request. The patient was silent, anesthetized, chest rising in slow rhythm. I told myself I was lucky to be there, to see what few others could. But every time the scalpels split flesh and the suction hummed, I felt a cold prickle crawl along my spine. The senior surgeon barked an instruction, and I fumbled to hand him the right tool. His gloved fingers brushed mine as he took it, his eyes meeting mine for only a heartbeat. Something about his stare unsettled me. Too steady, too knowing. He turned back without a word, and the sound of cutting filled the room again. The clock on the wall ticked far too slow, dragging each second out until the air itself seemed to stretch with it. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, where shadows of the surgical team swayed and writhed under the harsh light. They seemed longer than they should, stretching too far, bending in ways the bodies above them didn't. I blinked hard, but when I looked again, the shadows were still, perfectly normal, as if daring me to question them aloud. When the procedure ended, the surgeons moved wordlessly to clean and cover. One of them gestured for me to help wheel the body out. Not a patient, a body. I hadn't noticed when the rhythm of the chest had stopped. No one said a word about it, no one flinched. They moved with calm routine, as though death had always been the plan. As I followed them through the dim corridor, the body under the sheet twitched once, faint but undeniable. My hands froze on the gurney's frame, but the surgeons didn't react. They only kept walking, their shadows trailing longer than the hall allowed. And in that silence, I realized I wasn't assisting in surgery anymore. I was assisting in something else. The operating theater was silent, except for the hum of machines and the soft drip of fluid into clear bags. I stood at the edge of the table, my gloves damp with sweat inside their latex skin. The surgeons moved with steady rhythm, their instruments flashing under the harsh lights. I kept my eyes fixed on the patient, trying to keep my nerves from showing, when the overhead lamps flickered once. Just a blink. But in that blink, everything shifted. The shadows stretched longer, bending across the walls, and when the light steadied again, the patient's eyes were open, wide, glassy, too aware. My breath caught in my throat. That shouldn't have been possible. The anesthesia was strong enough to drown every nerve, silence every thought. Still, those eyes darted wildly, pupils blown wide, rolling to meet mine. The chest on the table rose faster now, not in the slow mechanical rhythm of a sedated body, but in sharp, panicked gulps. The suction tube whined, pulling blood away, but the sound was drowned beneath a muffled groan. It came from the patient's throat, low and strangled, but undeniably alive. I looked to the surgeons, waiting for them to panic, to order more drugs, to call for help. But they didn't move. They didn't even flinch. Their hands kept working, cutting, pulling, stitching, as if nothing had changed. Their voices remained calm, issuing clipped instructions to one another that had nothing to do with the horror happening in front of us. The patient's mouth worked soundlessly, lips trembling around words that couldn't break free. His eyes bulged, fixed on me, pleading with a desperation that turned my stomach to stone. My own voice caught in my chest, frozen, useless. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the dark, the groan became a scream, raw and jagged, echoing off the steel and tile. When the lamps buzzed back to life, the scream had stopped. But the mouth was still open, locked in a silent wail, the throat vibrating like a bowstring under pressure. I wanted to run, to tear off the gloves and bolt from that suffocating room, but my body refused. My hands shook as I reached for the instruments I was told to pass, my mind screaming at the wrongness of it all. The patient's gaze never left mine, wide and desperate, until a single tear cut down his cheek. It mixed with the blood on his skin, red and clear, merging into one. And still, the surgeons worked as though they hadn't seen him wake at all. The patient's eyes still locked on mine, wide and shining. But the surgeons carried on as if his terror meant nothing. Their voices murmured through fabric masks, muffled and precise, each phrase clipped like part of a ritual. My hands trembled as I passed another instrument, the metal cold against my gloves. That was when I saw it, the edge of a mask shift, slipping just slightly as one of them leaned closer to the wound. It should have revealed skin, a mouth, anything human. Instead, beneath the fold of pale fabric, I glimpsed teeth, bare, gleaming. A grin stretched too wide, unbroken by lips or flesh. My throat tightened. I told myself I had imagined it, that exhaustion was twisting my vision. But then another surgeon turned, and his mask slid lower. White bone grinned back at me, hollow sockets where eyes should be stared out. Yet I still felt the weight of their gaze pinning me in place. I stumbled back a step, but no one else reacted. Not the anesthetist at the monitor, not the assistant at the far end of the table. Only me. The skeletal grin widened as the surgeon raised a hand. The glove crinkled, and for a heartbeat, it looked normal. Then the fabric tore, curling away to reveal fingers stripped of flesh, long bones gleaming under the light. They moved with impossible precision, delicate, deliberate, guiding the scalpel with a grace no living hand could possess. The others followed, their gloves splitting like old paper. Skeletal hands worked in perfect rhythm, clicking faintly as bone tapped against steel. Their masks sagged further, and now the room was filled with grins, empty sockets, and the slow scrape of bone moving beneath the harsh lights. The patient convulsed, his silent scream shaking his whole body. His eyes darted frantically between them, then fixed on me, begging. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My clipboard slipped from my fingers, clattering against the floor. The sound echoed too long, bouncing back as if the walls themselves wanted to mock me. The surgeons all turned at once, their skulls glinting under the lamps, their sockets voids that swallowed light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their grins said everything. And in that unbearable silence, one skeletal hand reached out toward me. Not with an instrument, but empty, beckoning, as if it had always known I was meant to join them on the other side of the table. The skeletal hand lingered in the air, bony fingers curling as if beckoning me forward. I pressed my back against the wall, praying the room would shift back to something normal, that I would blink and see masks and gloves again. But the grins only widened, bone gleaming under the white lights. Their hollow sockets locked on me, unblinking, fixed in predatory stillness. The heart monitor beside the patient beeped in steady rhythm, sharp and relentless. Beep, beep, beep. The sound filled every corner of the operating theater, louder than the suction, louder than my own thundering pulse. And then the surgeons began to move. They raised their knives, scalpels, bone saws, glinting tools of steel now aimed not at the patient, but at me. Their skeletal arms extended, slow, when deliberate, the blades catching the sterile light. Their jaws did not move, but the room filled with sound. A chant, low and guttural, threaded with something ancient, each syllable hitting in perfect time with the monitor's pulse. Beep, word, beep, word. The rhythm climbed, chanting and beeping, weaving together until they were indistinguishable. My chest heaved, every breath ragged, but the sound forced its way into me, aligning my heart with theirs. I clutched at my chest, terrified that my pulse was no longer mine, that it belonged to their chant. The patient on the table convulsed violently, his eyes bulging, his body jerking against the straps. His silent scream returned, mouth gaping wider. But the chant drowned him out, swallowing every plea. Blood seeped from his stitches, running down his sides, pooling on the floor as if the body itself could no longer hold together. The knives lifted higher, their points now gleaming above their skulls. One surgeon stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the tiles until it merged with mine. His blade lowered, tip aimed straight at my chest. The chant quickened, the heart monitor racing, each beat hammering through me until my ribs ached. I tried to scream, to bolt, but my body betrayed me. My legs locked in place, my arms pinned at my sides, my voice caught in my throat, crushed beneath the rhythm. All I could do was stand there as their skeletal hands closed around their instruments, the blades descending in unison, the chant rising to a fever pitch. And with every beat of the heart monitor, I knew they weren't cutting flesh anymore. They were cutting time, carving away the seconds I had left. The chant swallowed me whole, every syllable pounding through my body until blackness surged in at the edges of my vision. I thought I had fainted. I thought maybe I had escaped. But when I opened my eyes again, the lights above me glared brighter than before, burning against my skull. My arms would not move, My legs were strapped tight. The cold sting of leather bit into my wrists. I was no longer at the edge of the room. I was on the table. My breath hitched, shallow and uneven. I tilted my head just enough to glimpse the truth. My chest was open. My skin pulled back by clamps that gleamed under the surgical lamps. My ribs pried wide like a door forced off its hinges. The sharp smell of blood filled my nose, hot and raw, mixing with antiseptic until the air itself became poison. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out was small, broken, more breath than voice. The surgeons loomed over me, their skulls gleaming white, their empty sockets staring down with hungry stillness. Their skeletal fingers worked quickly, weaving between veins and bone, as though they had done this countless times before. The heart monitor beside me kept pace, too fast, each beep echoing through the hollow of my open chest. I could feel it, my heart thudding weakly, exposed, trembling against the cold air. One surgeon leaned close, tilting his skull down until I could see myself reflected in the steel of his blade. He whispered in a voice colder than stone, though his jaw never moved. "Now, we begin." The others answered in unison, their chant starting anew, each word syncing perfectly with the rhythm of my failing pulse. I tried to wrench free, to thrash, to break the straps, but my body wouldn't obey. My vision swam as the skeletal hands dug deeper, pulling, cutting, rearranging. Above the glare of the lights, shadows danced wildly, their shapes grotesque, stretching longer than the room should allow. I caught sight of the patient from before, lying on a second table beside mine, his eyes open, staring at me with hollow despair. His chest was caved in, empty, nothing left but a cavity where his heart had been. The scalpel pressed deeper into me, cold as ice. The chant grew deafening, rising to a fevered pitch, and in that instant, I understood. I wasn't here to witness. I wasn't here to learn. I was the procedure, and they had only just begun. On my first night walking the ward, the head of security gave me one rule. "Ignore the last door," he said, his voice flat, eyes fixed anywhere but mine. "Doesn't matter what you hear. Doesn't matter what you think you see. You don't go near it." He didn't explain further, only pressed the ring of keys into my palm and left me standing there with the buzz of fluorescent lights and the faint hum of machines filling the silence. The ward itself was uneventful, a long corridor lined with doors that all looked the same. Patients slept behind most of them, their monitors blinking steadily, the occasional cough or shuffle echoing through the quiet. I walked slowly, listening, trying to convince myself I could handle the boredom, the sterile emptiness. But the moment I reached the far end, my chest tightened. The last door was different. Heavy, thicker than the rest, its paint a darker shade, as though it had been replaced more than once. The handle bore scratches, deep gouges in the metal, like someone had clawed at it with broken nails. I stared too long, curiosity buzzing louder than caution, until the overhead light flickered and snapped me out of it. I turned away, reminding myself of the warning. Still, the sound started as I walked back. Faint at first, a low moan, like someone straining against a weight too heavy to bear. I froze, my ears straining, but the noise faded. I kept moving, heart thudding harder than it should. Minutes later, the sound came again, louder, sharper, a cry this time, a scream. I stopped in the middle of the hall, palms damp around the flashlight. The sound wasn't muffled like it should have been behind thick walls. It clawed through the air, raw and jagged, echoing in my bones. I turned, eyes darting to the last door. The scream came from there, no doubt now. My training told me to radio it in. My gut told me to walk the other way. But my feet stayed rooted, listening to the voice rise higher, breaking, shattering, until it was almost unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ward fell silent again. The light above the last door buzzed, flickering once, twice, before it burned steady again. The handle gleamed faintly, as though freshly touched. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to walk away. But even as I turned, I felt it. The weight of eyes staring from the crack beneath that door. Eyes that hadn't blinked once since I arrived. The screams began again on my second night, long before midnight settled its weight over the ward. They started faint, barely louder than a cough carried down the corridor, but quickly sharpened into something jagged, metallic, like rusted steel being torn apart. I froze halfway down the hall, every instinct begging me to turn back. But the sound drew me closer. Each cry rattled through the air vents, scraping along the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The last door pulsed with it, vibrating faintly in its frame as though it barely held against the force behind it. The metal handle glimmered wet in the fluorescent light, though no one had touched it. I swallowed hard, pressing my back to the opposite wall, forcing myself to keep my distance. The rule was clear. Ignore it. Pretend it wasn't there. But the screams refused to be ignored. They rose in waves, low moans swelling into guttural cries that scraped raw against my ears. At times, it sounded like one voice, singular and desperate. At others, it fractured, splitting into a dozen throats, shrieking in layered agony. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I scanned the empty hall, searching for proof that someone else was hearing it too. But the ward was empty. The other doors stayed shut, patients asleep, monitors beeping in perfect rhythm. Only the last door broke the silence, bleeding sound into the bones of the building. I clutched my radio, thumb hovering over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. I already knew what the response would be. The same flat tone. Ignore it. As if that was possible. The screams shifted, breaking into wet gurgles, then returned sharper, piercing enough to make my teeth ache. I covered my ears, but the sound sank straight through, vibrating in my skull. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was inside me, clawing along the edges of thought, pressing against places words couldn't reach. And then, without warning, it stopped. The silence hit harder than the noise, heavy and absolute. My breath sounded too loud in my own ears, echoing down the corridor. I dared a glance at the last door. It stood still now, dark, quiet, its handle dry and ordinary once more. But as I turned to leave, the metallic echo followed me, faint and mocking. Not from behind the door this time, from the vents above my head, whispering the shape of a scream that hadn't finished yet. By the third night, the screams had carved themselves into my nerves. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't stop hearing them even when the ward was quiet. They followed me in the hum of the lights, in the hiss of the vents, in the hollow between each of my breaths. The rule pressed against me like a weight. Ignore the last door. But rules crumble when curiosity gnaws deeper than fear. The corridor was empty, the other rooms asleep, their steady beeps and sighs dull against the pounding of my own heart. I stood before the last door, its surface colder than the air, my reflection warped in the scratched metal. The handle seemed to twitch faintly, like it wanted me to grip it. My hand shook as I reached out, expecting resistance, locks, alarms. But the door opened with a soft click, smooth and welcoming, as though it had always been waiting. The room inside was smaller than I expected, swallowed in shadows despite the weak fluorescent bulb flickering overhead. The walls were stained a color that might once have been white, but years of damp had turned them the shade of bone left too long in the earth. In the center stood a single bed. It was bolted to the floor with heavy chains, links thick enough to hold back something far stronger than a patient. The mattress sagged, torn open in places, its stuffing spilling out like pale entrails. Restraints hung from the bed frame, frayed at the edges, their buckles darkened with stains I didn't dare name. No one was there. No voice, no body. Just the bed, the chains, the silence. The air carried a faint metallic tang, old and sharp, the kind that clung to your teeth after the taste of blood. My flashlight beam jittered across the corners, but there was nothing else. No monitors, no furniture. Nothing to justify the screams that had filled the ward for nights. I backed out slowly, heart hammering, breath shallow. For the first time, I thought maybe the rule wasn't about keeping something locked inside. Maybe it was about keeping us out. As the door eased shut behind me, the bulb flickered one last time. The bed moved. Not much, just enough to scrape the chains across the floor. A metallic groan that echoed long after the door latched. And from the silence that followed, I heard the faintest exhale. Like something beneath the sheets had only just stopped holding its breath. By the fourth night, I swore I would not go near it again. The memory of that chained bed had lodged itself behind my eyes, replaying each time I blinked. Still, I found myself walking the length of the corridor, my patrol dragging slower and slower as I approached the last door. The ward was silent but for the distant hum of machines and the faint tick of the lights overhead. Then it began. The screaming. It started as usual, raw, metallic, broken, but almost instantly it shifted. The sound cut sharper, angrier, closer, vibrating straight through the walls. My chest tightened. This time it was different. This time it wasn't just noise. It was my name. The syllables ripped through the air, jagged and wet, screamed over and over until the sound hardly resembled language anymore. My legs turned to ice, my skin crawling as the door shuddered against the force of it. I staggered back, pressing my shoulders to the opposite wall, my radio buzzing at my side. My name again, louder, stretched out as if pulled apart by something inhuman. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body betrayed me, dragging me closer, step by step. The hall warped, pulling me forward, until I was only a breath away from the handle. My name thundered from inside, pounding against my skull, raw and insistent. Whoever, or whatever, was in there knew me, wanted me, demanded me. I clapped my hands to my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound bypassed flesh, crawled straight into my bones. I could feel it vibrating in my ribs, rattling my teeth, stitching itself into the rhythm of my heart. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence. The hall fell dead still, the lights buzzing faintly above. I froze, chest heaving, sweat rolling cold down my back. For one breath, I almost believed it was over. But then, from the crack beneath the door, a whisper leaked out. My name again, spoken low, intimate, almost tender. It curled into me like a hand on my shoulder. The bulb above the door flickered once, and in that instant, I knew the screaming room wasn't just calling, it was waiting for me to answer. The fifth night, I told myself I wouldn't go near it. I swore I would keep to my rounds, keep my eyes forward, keep my ears shut against whatever tore the silence open. But rules and promises don't matter when the building itself tilts you forward. When every light flicker, every echo of a footstep drags you to the end of the hall. The last door waited, its handle dull and cold, as if it had been gripped by something long dead, My body moved without permission, my hand reaching, twisting, pulling. The door opened smoother than before, welcoming me like an old friend. The room was the same and not the same. The flickering bulb overhead cast its light in sickly pulses, shadows rippling along the stained walls. The chains clinked faintly as if stirred by breath. And on the bed. This time, the bed was not empty. I froze, my chest seizing as the flashlight beam landed on the figure strapped down. Arms buckled in restraints, ankles bound tight, chest heaving shallow beneath torn fabric. My throat closed when I saw the face. It was mine. Pale skin stretched taut, eyes wide and bloodshot, mouth open in a scream I could not hear but could feel vibrating in my bones. The sound seemed to bypass the air, tearing directly through me. My double's throat was raw, split, shredded from endless cries, blood slicking the straps where it had thrashed. The echo of it filled the room without sound, a silence louder than any noise. I staggered forward, unable to look away, every instinct torn between freeing it and running from it. The figure's eyes met mine. My own eyes, pleading, broken, and still screaming in silence. My legs shook so hard I almost fell. Then the bed shuddered. The chains rattled, pulling taut, as though the figure strained to rise. The bulb overhead flickered hard, and for one breath the room vanished in darkness. When the light buzzed back to life, the bed was still full, but the figure was gone. I looked down, heart hammering, and saw the straps across my own wrists. The leather bit deep, my arms pinned, my chest bound. My throat burned raw, every breath tearing with the weight of screams I didn't remember giving. The bulb flickered once more. I turned my head as far as I could. In the corner of the room, another figure stood, watching. It leaned close, whispering my name in a voice I already knew. And then I understood. The screaming room never held anyone else. It had only ever been waiting for me. The nights on intake blurred into one another, endless lists of names, symptoms, and times logged into the system. I sat beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like a swarm of insects, the steady drone of the waiting room pressing in behind the glass. Most patients came in frantic, bloodied, pale, wheezing, desperate for care that often came too late. I typed, asked the questions, checked the boxes. Routine, detached, that's what I told myself. But then, there were the ones who didn't stay. I noticed it first with a young man brought in after a car accident. His face was pale, his clothes stiff with blood. But he was lucid, answering questions through gritted teeth as I typed his details into the system. A nurse wheeled him past, and that should have been it. But when I checked later, his name wasn't on the chart. His bed was empty. No one remembered seeing him come through. My supervisor brushed it off as a clerical error, a mistyped name, but I knew better. It kept happening. A woman with burns up her arms, her screams echoing as they wheeled her down the corridor, gone. A child, whimpering softly with his mother clutching his hand, gone. Each time I logged the names, the times, the symptoms. Each time I went back, the records had vanished, as if I had imagined them. The nurses avoided my eyes when I asked. The doctors grew curt, telling me not to worry about things outside my role. But I couldn't ignore it. Their voices haunted the ward even after they were gone, faint cries leaking through vents, the shuffle of unseen feet echoing in empty hallways. One night, I scrolled through the system, searching for proof. My fingers trembled as I typed, convinced I would find at least one name I had entered. But the screen stayed blank, mocking me with its silence. That was when I noticed the reflection in the monitor. Behind me, just over my shoulder, a shape flickered. Thin, blurred, but leaning close, as though reading along. I spun, but the intake desk was empty, the waiting room still. Yet the smell of antiseptic and iron thickened in the air, and a faint trail of wet footprints led from the entrance toward the dark halls. When I looked back at the monitor, the screen was no longer blank. My own name had appeared at the top of the intake list, the timestamp marked for that very night. I came in early the next evening, determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The names still clung to me, burned into memory with a clarity no database could erase. I started with the boy and his mother, their faces vivid in my thoughts. The way her hand trembled as she smoothed his hair, the way his whimpers sounded like it might never end. Typed their details carefully, letter by letter, into the system. The search bar blinked once, then spat back nothing. No record, no trace. I tried the burned woman, nothing. The young man from the car accident, nothing. Each name returned the same hollow response. No such patient exists. My fingers grew numb, my breathing shallow. I wasn't just imagining mistakes in paperwork. According to the records, these people had never lived at all. I printed what little I could, scraps of admission slips I swore I had filled. The paper came out blank. My pulse hammered as I fed the machine another form, but it spat out only whiteness, clean and untouched, as though the names dissolved the moment I tried to give them weight. At the station beside me, a nurse looked over, her eyes flat, her voice too calm. "Sometimes patients are misremembered," she said. Misremembered. Like the child screaming in my ears was just a trick of memory. Like the smell of scorched flesh that still clung to my clothes wasn't real. I went further, digging through archived files, locked cabinets in the back room. Every chart I pulled was the same. The names I remembered weren't there. But as I searched, I began to notice something worse. Each drawer had gaps, folders missing, rows of files neatly rearranged to hide their absence. Whole sections had been erased with care. The room chilled, the hum of the fluorescent lights growing louder, pressing into my skull. When I turned back to the desk, the monitor glowed bright, though I hadn't touched it. Lines of text crawled across the screen, filling it in quick strokes, as if an unseen hand were typing faster than I could follow. One phrase repeated over and over, stacked on top of itself, filling every inch of space until the words blurred together. They were never here. And in the black reflection of the monitor's glass, I saw rows of empty beds stretching into the dark, each one waiting, each one with my name already written at the foot. I wasn't satisfied with the records. Paper could be tampered with, systems could be scrubbed. But cameras? Cameras didn't lie. That was what I told myself as I slipped into the security office, the stale air heavy with burnt coffee and cigarette smoke. Rows of monitors glowed against the dark, the feeds looping silently through the wards, the halls, the intake desk, where I sat night after night. I pulled the tapes for the nights I remembered them most clearly. The boy and his mother, the burned woman, the car crash victim, each memory vivid in my head. My hands trembled as I loaded the first tape, the static hissing before the image steadied. There he was, the boy, small and fragile, clutching his mother's hand as I typed into the system. The relief hit so hard, my knees nearly gave. Proof, undeniable proof. I leaned closer as the footage rolled on, watching them push down the corridor on a gurney. Then the tape flickered. The hallway darkened, though the lights were steady in reality. Their bodies blurred, edges bleeding into the shadows on the floor. The boy thrashed, his mother's face a mask of terror, but their shapes smeared like wet ink. Within seconds, they were gone. Not wheeled out of frame, not hidden behind a door. They dissolved into the blackness, pooling beneath the gurney, vanishing until only the empty bed remained, rolling forward. My stomach turned to ice. I switched tapes, desperate for a glitch to blame. But it happened again. The burned woman writhed, her screams spilling through memory, if not the silent footage. Her body unraveling into strands of shadow until nothing was left. Her gurney rattled forward on its own, restraints flapping like dead weight. One by one, each tape showed the same horror. Patients melting away into darkness that seemed alive, swallowing them whole. No doctors noticed, no nurses paused. The halls bustled as though nothing was amiss. Staff walking past gurneys where bodies no longer lay. The final tape was the worst. The man from the car crash, his eyes locked on the camera, locked on me, even as the shadows crawled up his body. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words I knew without hearing. Help me. His lips kept moving as his face dissolved, his plea stretching on even after he was gone. I slammed the monitor off, my breath jagged, heart hammering. But in the reflection of the blank screen, I wasn't alone. A shape loomed over my shoulder, dark, shifting, gurney wheels squealing softly in the silence. The next night, I couldn't shake the image of that last tape. The man's lips forming words meant only for me as the shadows devoured him. His eyes had followed me into sleep, into every blink. I needed answers, something concrete, something that proved I still had ground beneath me. So I went where I wasn't supposed to go, the admissions archive. The room was dim, lit only by the green glow of an old exit sign. Cabinets stretched wall to wall, drawers groaning with files, the air heavy with dust, and the faint sour smell of paper left too long in the dark. My hands shook as I flipped through folders, searching for the names I knew. Empty gaps greeted me, the spaces where they should have been like missing teeth in a rotten mouth. And then I saw it, a folder thick and heavy, the manila edges worn from too much handling. My own name, scrawled across the tab in black ink. My breath faltered as I slid it open. The forms inside were unmistakable. Patient intake, condition notes, consent signatures. And on every line where my name was required, there it was. My handwriting, precise, familiar, undeniably mine. But the dates. God, the dates. Tomorrow's date. Every page stamped with a day not yet passed, a day that hadn't come. I traced the ink with a trembling finger, feeling the indentation of my pen stroke, as though I had already written them and forgotten. As though the act was waiting in me, inevitable. The diagnosis field was blank, but the notes section chilled me most. One line, scrawled at the bottom in handwriting not mine. Subject admits willingly. A crash echoed somewhere deep in the archives, a drawer slamming shut, metal rattling against metal. I froze, clutching the folder to my chest, listening. The silence stretched, then came the faint squeal of gurney wheels rolling across tile, moving closer, impossibly close. I shoved the folder back, my hands slick, heart hammering against my ribs. When I turned to leave, the exit sign flickered, plunging the room into darkness for half a breath. In that moment, I swore I felt a hand close over mine. My own hand, cold and lifeless, guiding the pen across the page. And when the light returned, the folder on the desk was open again, the last page still waiting. The signature line empty, the pen already uncapped. I stood there with the pen in my hand, the page waiting, my name already scrawled across every form that should not exist. My pulse hammered so hard it shook the ink, smudging the edge of the signature. I told myself to stop, to walk away, to burn the file and never look back. But something in the room pressed down on me, heavier than gravity, heavier than fear. The air itself seemed to whisper that it didn't matter what I chose. The page would be signed, one way or another. I forced my head up, ready to scream, to throw the pen across the room. But the breath died in my throat. The archives weren't empty anymore. 2 orderlies stood in the doorway, their uniforms pristine, their faces hidden in shadow. Their hands gripped the frame of a gurney that gleamed under the weak exit sign, its sheet pulled tight, straps already buckled open, waiting. Before I could step back, before I could fight, they were moving. The wheels squealed against the floor, loud, unbearable, echoing the sound I'd heard night after night in the security tapes. My knees buckled, the folder slipping from my hands, papers scattering like pale leaves across the tiles. I tried to run, but my body betrayed me. Muscles stiff, joints heavy, as though I'd already been sedated. They reached me in silence. Hands gripped my arms, strong, unyielding, cold through the fabric of my sleeves. I thrashed weakly, my voice catching in my throat, but no sound came out. The pen clattered against the floor, rolling until it stopped neatly, beside the gurney. The orderlies lifted me with mechanical ease, lowering me onto the mattress. The restraints snapped shut with a finality that rattled through my bones. I turned my head, chest heaving, and caught a glimpse of the clipboard resting on my chest. My own file, neatly closed, complete now. The line that had been empty moments before bore my signature. Fresh, black, absolute. The wheels began to move, the ceiling lights sliding past in blinding pulses as they wheeled me deeper into the corridors. I strained against the straps until my wrists burned, but it was useless. The shadows in the corners leaned closer, pressing in, watching. And as the doors swung open ahead, I realized where they were taking me. The ward was full of empty beds, lined in silence, each one waiting for its patient. The missing hadn't vanished. They had been claimed, and now so had I. They called me in at the last minute, the kind of favor no one wanted but someone had to take. A nurse had gone home sick, another never showed up, so I was told to cover night duty in the quarantine wing. The supervisor's eyes slid away from mine as he handed me the key card, as if even saying the assignment aloud was something to be avoided. The wing was buried at the far end of the hospital, behind a set of heavy double doors plastered with faded biohazard signs. The airlock hissed as I stepped through, the seals groaning as though the building itself resented being disturbed. My mask itched against my skin, the smell of bleach and chemicals biting the back of my throat. Beyond the airlock stretched a corridor stripped bare, no posters, no windows, nothing but walls washed too many times in disinfectant until they gleamed like bone. There were only 4 rooms, each one locked tight, glass panels in the doors fogged from within. I was told there hadn't been patients here in years, not since the last outbreak, but I still felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from behind the cloudy glass. My assignment was simple. Monitor log rounds, make sure no one entered. Easy. Too easy. The silence in that place was wrong. Not the ordinary hush of a sleeping ward, but a dead silence that seemed to smother every sound I made. My footsteps rang too loud, echoing in a corridor that shouldn't have carried echoes. Even my breath sounded strange inside the mask, too shallow, too fast, like it wasn't only mine. I sat up at the small desk by the entrance, trying to ignore the heavy stillness pressing in from all sides. The logbook lay open, filled with dates and signatures that stretched back further than I expected. The last entry scrawled in hurried handwriting from a year ago. Do not stay longer than necessary. The lights flickered overhead, humming low before stabilizing again. For a moment, the glass panels in the doors cleared, just enough for me to glimpse something shifting inside one of the rooms. A blur, a figure, the suggestion of movement where there should be none. I blinked, heart pounding, and the glass was fogged again. Empty, supposedly empty. The airlock doors sealed behind me with a final hiss, the locks engaging. I realized then that I hadn't been assigned to watch an abandoned wing. I had been locked inside it. The logbook swore every room was empty, nothing but dust and sealed beds behind the glass. Yet, as I made my first round, clipboard in hand, the fogged windows told a different story. The moisture on the panes shimmered faintly in the harsh fluorescent light. And there, pressed into it, were handprints. They weren't faint. They weren't old. The shapes were sharp, clear, fresh, fingers splayed wide, palms dragging down the glass as if someone inside had tried to claw their way out. I stopped dead, my breath catching in the mask, and stared at the first room's window. The prints were small, overlapping, frantic. They streaked downward, cutting through the fog until the moisture beaded at the base of the glass. I forced myself to check the monitor outside the room. It blinked steady green, unoccupied. The clipboard agreed. No patient assigned, no activity logged. But the glass didn't lie. My chest tightened as I leaned closer, my reflection warped in the pain. For a moment, I swore I saw another reflection overlapping mine. A face, wide-eyed, mouth open in silence. When I blinked, it was gone. I tried the next room. More handprints. These larger, stronger, smeared sideways as though something had been dragged across the pane. The fog seemed thicker here, breathy, alive, rising and falling like lungs against the glass. My hand shook as I wrote the word clear in the log, because what else could I write? By the third room, I didn't want to look, but I had to. The glass was covered in prints. Dozens, maybe hundreds, layered until the surface looked bruised. They clustered around the edges, pressed in tight circles, as though an entire crowd had gathered just behind the fog. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stumbled back, almost dropping the clipboard, my mask fogging with my breath. The silence of the wing grew heavier, thick with a sound that wasn't sound, a weight in the air, a pressure on my chest, as though all those unseen hands were pressing on me now, not the glass. When I returned to the desk, desperate for air that felt real, the logbook was no longer where I'd left it. It sat open, a fresh entry written in a hand that wasn't mine. 4 words, scrawled hard enough to tear the page. Do not open the doors. The ink still glistened wet. The silence didn't last. It began as a faint rattle, so soft I thought it was only the air system kicking on. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. Not machinery, not pipes. It was a cough. It came from somewhere deep in the wing, low and broken, rattling through the corridor like shards of glass grinding together. I froze, every muscle tightening, the clipboard slipping from my damp grip. The sound rose again, harsher, each breath a jagged scrape that seemed to claw at the walls themselves. The monitors on the doors stayed green, unoccupied. The logbook insisted I was alone. Yet the coughing grew louder, dragging closer, filling the air with a sick wetness I could almost taste through the mask. My skin prickled as I realized it wasn't steady. It was coming in bursts, gasps between choking hacks, the way someone sounds when they're drowning in their own lungs. I forced myself down the corridor, each step a battle against the instinct screaming at me to turn back. The coughing stopped when I reached the first door. My flashlight beam cut across the fogged glass, revealing only handprints streaked downward in smears. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Then it came again, louder, sharper, from the next room. I staggered to it, pressing closer to the pane. Still nothing, just fog and the faint trace of fingers. The cough erupted again, this time so violent it shook the air, a rattle like bones splintering. It wasn't coming from behind one door. It was moving, following me. The sound scraped down the corridor, closer and closer, bouncing from room to room until it was right behind me. I spun, flashlight slicing through the sterile air, but the hallway stretched empty, lights humming faintly overhead. Still, the coughing continued, right at my back, as if someone stood inches away, lungs collapsing with every breath. I staggered to the desk, clutching its edge, desperate for some proof I wasn't losing my mind. The logbook lay open again, a new line added beneath the last warning. The handwriting was jagged this time, almost frantic, as though scrawled in a hurry. Don't breathe with them. The coughs swelled suddenly, exploding into a chorus, dozens of voices hacking and choking in unison from every room around me. The glass fogged thicker, as if pressed by lungs gasping against it. And in that moment I realized the air in my mask wasn't mine anymore. It rattled in and out of me in time with theirs. The coughing faded into a wet hush, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed heavy, like the air itself waited for me to make the next move. My mask grew hot with my own breath, fogging as I forced myself to walk the corridor again. The lights above buzzed and stuttered, each flicker carving the hallway into sharp slices of shadow. At the first room, I stopped. The glass panel was almost opaque with condensation, streaks of old handprints staining its surface. I wiped my sleeve across it, just enough to clear a circle, and nearly collapsed when a face stared back at me. The skin was blistered, peeling in wet sheets that revealed raw flesh beneath. One eye was swollen shut, the other bulging wide, bloodshot and frantic. Its lips were cracked, bleeding, pressed hard against the glass as though straining to breathe through me. I stumbled back, gagging into the mask, my heart hammering so loud it drowned the hum of the lights. I staggered to the next door, praying the first was some hallucination, a trick of exhaustion. But this pain, too, bore a face. Different. A woman this time, her cheeks split open by angry welts, her teeth bared in a rictus grin as pus bubbled from sores across her chin. She pressed her forehead to the glass, leaving streaks of yellowed fluid sliding down. By the third room, I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Multiple faces this time, pressed together against the pane. Their blistered skin sloughed off in ribbons, their mouths opening and closing in wet silence. Their eyes rolled wildly, and though I couldn't hear them through the seals, I felt their screaming. The fog pulsed with every imagined cry. My legs trembled as I backed into the center of the hall. Every pane glistened with movement now. Faces emerging, fading, replaced by others. Too many. Some clawing at the glass with peeling fingers, leaving trails of blood and skin smeared across the fog. Others only staring, mouths gaping open, waiting for me to draw nearer. The lights flickered hard, plunging the corridor into black for a heartbeat. When they snapped back on, every window held a face, all pressed close, blistered and breaking, their eyes locked on me alone. The glass groaned as they leaned harder, as though it was never meant to hold them back. The faces stayed pressed to the glass, their blistered skin sloughing away in wet ribbons, their eyes locked on mine. I couldn't breathe. My mask felt useless. The air inside thick and hot as though it belonged to them, not me. I told myself the glass was my barrier, the only thing keeping me alive. But the thought crumbled the moment I saw it. The reflection. In the fogged pane of the nearest door, I should have seen myself. A figure in scrubs, mask tight across my face, flashlight trembling in my hand. But what stared back wasn't me. The reflection grinned, maskless, its lips split and peeling, gums black, teeth rotting down to stumps. The smile spread too wide, tearing the corners of its mouth until dark saliva dripped down the glass. My stomach lurched, bile burning my throat as I staggered back. But the reflection didn't follow. It stayed pressed to the pane, smiling with a hunger that wasn't mine. I raised a shaking hand to touch the glass, needing to prove it wasn't real. The reflection lifted its hand too, but slower, more deliberate. Fingers blistered and flayed, nails split to the quick. When my skin met the cold pane, there should have been separation. But there wasn't. I felt it. Flesh against flesh. The glass no longer existed. My hand slid straight through into something wet and soft, sinking into the reflection's palm as though I had dipped it into rotting meat. The faces around me pressed harder, their teeth clacking, their gums splitting open in anticipation. The reflection leaned closer until its breath fogged against my skin, sour and rancid, leaking straight into my lungs. My mask dissolved like paper, strands of it falling away. In the glass, my reflection opened its mouth, wide, impossibly wide, and rows of blackened teeth split with sores grinned back at me. And then I felt it, my own mouth stretching, my lips cracking, my gums burning. I tried to scream, but only a wet, gurgling laugh poured out. The corridor warped around me, the faces no longer behind glass. They were here, pressing against my shoulders, my chest, their hands clawing down my arms. I was one of them, my smile rotting, my breath thick, my reflection no longer separate. The last thought that pierced the haze was the logbook's warning. Do not stay longer than necessary. But it was too late. I wasn't leaving. I was home. They sent me for gauze and saline, nothing unusual. Just another errand to break up the monotony of the shift. The supply clerk told me to check storage downstairs, handed me a ring of keys without looking me in the eye. I thought he meant the regular storeroom, the one every nurse knew. But when I followed the signs down, past laundry and maintenance, I found myself at a door I had never seen before. The paint was flaking, the metal handle cold, and a single word was stenciled faintly on the surface. Basement. No one had ever mentioned a basement. I had worked in this hospital long enough to know its corridors, its hidden stairwells, its forgotten wings. Yet here was a door no one spoke of, standing at the bottom of a narrow stairwell, waiting. The key slid in too easily, as if the lock had been oiled for this exact moment. The hinges groaned when I pushed it open, the sound swallowed by the dark beyond. A smell rose up, thick and clinging, damp concrete, mold, and something sharper beneath, like rust and old blood. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a metallic thud that echoed too long. My flashlight beam carved thin slices through the dark, revealing walls sweating with moisture and pipes overhead that dripped steadily onto the cracked floor. Shadows clung to corners, too dense, too patient, as though they had been waiting in silence for years. Rows of shelves stretched away into the dark, stacked with boxes unmarked, their cardboard sagging with damp. I moved between them, the sound of my footsteps muted, muffled, as if the air itself wanted me quiet. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, though the shelves were empty of life. At the far wall, I found another door, smaller, older, with no keyhole. Scratched into the wood in uneven gouges were words barely legible under the flashlight. Do not enter. The letters cut deep, desperate as though carved by someone with shaking hands. A chill spread down my spine. The hospital above me was sterile, controlled, alive with routine. Down here, none of that order reached. This place didn't exist on maps or in staff conversations. And yet the door waited, the warning etched into it, promising more than it protected. Behind me, the shelves groaned, the sound of something shifting just out of the beam of my light. The shelves behind me settled into silence again, but the sound had already burrowed under my skin. I turned back toward the narrow passage, the beam of my flashlight jittering with the tremor in my hand. The air grew heavier the deeper I went, thick with the stink of rotten iron. The concrete walls glistened, rivulets of water, or something darker, dripping down in slow, steady trails. Every drop echoed like a clock counting down. As the corridor widened, the beam of light revealed shapes lining the walls. At first, I thought they were abandoned stretchers, forgotten equipment shoved down here to rust. But as I drew closer, my stomach twisted. Rows of gurneys stretched into the dark, their metal frames orange with corrosion, wheels fused to the floor by years of filth. Thick leather restraints dangled from their sides, stiff with what looked like dried blood. Some straps were snapped, as though whatever had been bound there had struggled long after the staff had gone. The walls behind the gurneys bore marks too, scratches carved deep into concrete, parallel lines where fingernails had broken and splintered in desperate scrabbling. Some of the grooves were fresh, edges still crumbling, as if carved only days ago. I forced myself to move closer to one gurney, the leather creaking as I brushed the strap with my glove. It broke apart under the lightest touch, crumbling into reddish dust that clung to my skin. The gurney rocked gently, as if something had only just climbed off it. A sudden drip landed on my face, cold and thick. I jerked my light upward, expecting a leak in the pipes. But the ceiling was bone dry. The wetness smeared across my cheek with a tacky smear that smelled too much like blood. The sound of wheels screeching cut through the silence, sharp and sudden. My beam swept wildly across the corridor, catching movement at the far end. One of the gurneys shuddered forward, its corroded wheels dragging against the cracked floor. It rolled a few feet, stopped, then shifted again, as if pushed by unseen hands. Every hair on my body lifted as more gurneys trembled in unison, their restraints swaying like pendulums, leather straps slapping softly against metal. The corridor filled with the sound of scraping metal and creaking frames, a slow procession waking from long sleep. And as I stumbled back, heart slamming in my chest, I realized every gurney had turned slightly, their rusted frames now angled toward me, waiting, watching, ready. The gurneys stood frozen again, angled like rusted sentinels in the dark. I forced myself forward, my steps echoing too loud against the cracked floor, the smell of iron and mildew curling deep into my lungs. I kept the flashlight low, afraid of what I might see if I let the beam wander too far. That was when I heard it, faint at first, like water gurgling through old pipes. But it wasn't water. The sound rose from the floor itself, from the drain set at intervals between the gurneys. I crouched by the nearest one, my hand trembling as I angled the light over the grate. The rusted slats glistened wet, and beneath them came a whisper. Not words at first, just the suggestion of breath, like someone speaking far away. Then it sharpened. My name, spoken softly, patiently, again and again. Each syllable dragged slow and deliberate, as though savoring the shape of it. I stumbled back, pulse thundering in my ears. But the next drain hissed too, carrying the same whisper, the same intimate repetition of my name. Then the next, and the next, until the whole corridor breathed with it. A chorus of unseen voices, patient and waiting, curling up from the dark below. I pressed my palms to my ears. But it didn't matter. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was in my head, sliding beneath my skin like smoke. The whispers grew more insistent, not pleading, not threatening, but coaxing. "Come down, come back. We've been waiting." My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if the batteries had been drained by the voices themselves. For an instant, the corridor plunged into black, and I swore I felt air rising from the drains, damp and hot against my ankles, fingers of breath curling around me. When the light steadied again, new shapes lined the gurneys. Not bodies, but impressions. Indentations pressed into the rusted frames, as though unseen forms lay strapped down still, heavy enough to bend metal, restless enough to leave the straps swaying. The whispers hushed all at once, silence slamming down like a lid. My breath came shallow through the mask as I backed toward the stairwell. Then, from directly beneath my feet, a voice clearer than the rest spoke again. It didn't just say my name this time. It said, "You belong here." The whispers sank back into the drains, leaving a silence so absolute it rang in my skull. I should have turned and fled, but something in me pushed forward, down the corridor lined with rusted gurneys and dripping walls. The air grew heavier the farther I went, thick and sweet like rotting fruit, clinging to the back of my throat. The beam of my flashlight shook across the tiles, catching streaks of something dark smeared along the floor. Footprints, bare, wet, leading deeper. They glistened as though freshly made, though no one was there to leave them. My heart pounded as I followed, unwilling, every step slower than the last. At the very end of the corridor, the light caught them. Figures, still as statues, lined up in the glow of my trembling beam. They wore gowns, the kind patients were issued upstairs. But these were wrong. The fabric wasn't fabric at all. My breath hitched as I realized what I was seeing. Layers of flesh, stitched crudely together, seams puckered and weeping, the color pale and waxy. The gowns clung wetly to their bodies, slick and glistening with rot. Their heads were bowed, their faces hidden behind curtains of matted hair. Each one's chest rose and fell with a shallow, unnatural rhythm, as though their lungs were full of water. The stitching across their gowns stretched and tightened with every breath. I wanted to run. God, I wanted to. But my legs locked, rooted to the floor as if the drains had sent their whispers up through my bones and anchored me there. Then one of them lifted its head. Slowly, mechanically. The hair parted just enough for me to glimpse a face stitched shut, lips sewn together in black thread, yet trembling as though trying to speak. Another raised its arm, the gown tightening at the seams, revealing skin underneath mottled with burns. The arm moving like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The rest began to stir in unison, heads tilting, jaws straining against the stitches, their movements jagged, puppet-like. My flashlight dimmed, the batteries whining, and for one dreadful second, the beam caught their eyes. Rows of them, hollow sockets gleaming wet and red, all fixed on me. The light went out completely. In the pitch black, I heard the sound of their stitches tearing, one thread at a time, followed by the soft patter of bare feet starting toward me. I ran blind, the darkness behind me filled with the sound of tearing stitches and the slap of wet feet. My flashlight sputtered uselessly, throwing broken slices of light across walls that seemed to stretch longer with every step. I could feel them gaining, the air thick with their damp breath, the faint tug of fingers grazing my back. Then, like a miracle, I saw it. The elevator doors at the end of the passage, their metal faces glinting faintly in the dark. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, lungs burning, heart pounding. I slammed my hand against the call button again and again. praying it still worked. The bulb above flickered weakly, then the doors shuddered open. I stumbled inside, hitting the close button with frantic jabs. Just as the doors began to slide together, pale hands shot forward. Dozens of them, their fingers split with stitches, nails jagged, skin too loose on the bone. They clawed at the gap, stretching it wide enough for faces to press through, lips tearing as black threads snapped. I screamed and shoved with my whole body, forcing the doors shut against the swarm. The metal ground against their hands, bones cracking, flesh peeling as they pushed harder. The elevator groaned, motors whining, then finally the doors sealed with a slam that cut off their shrieks. I collapsed against the wall, sobbing for breath, my body trembling with relief as the elevator lurched upward. The numbers climbed sluggishly, each floor a lifetime away. When the car finally jolted to a stop, the bell chimed softly and the doors slid open. But there was no ward above, no sterile hallway, no hum of fluorescent lights, only the same dripping walls, the same rusted gurneys, the same endless basement corridor, stretching out before me, waiting. I staggered forward, my legs weak, my mind refusing to believe. I turned back to the elevator, but the doors had already shut. The panel dark, the button dead. The only sound was the steady drip from the ceiling, and somewhere far off, the patient voices whispering my name again. I realized then that there was no way out. The basement wasn't beneath the hospital at all. The basement was the hospital, and I had only ever been descending. And this time, the elevator wasn't coming back.